In the fall of 1985, a group of friends decided to spend their weekend hiking through the beautiful, rugged wilderness of the Angeles National Forest in Southern California. The air was cool, the leaves were changing color, and the trail they were following was peaceful and quiet. As they made their way down a long, winding dirt path, one of the hikers happened to glance off to the side, looking through the thick stand of pine trees and heavy brush that bordered the trail. Down in a small ravine running parallel to the path they were walking on, there was a small, shallow stream flowing gently over the rocks. The hiker stopped for a moment, scanning the water, when they noticed something that looked completely out of place. It was a dark, bulky shape lying in the middle of the shallow water, partially covered by the shadows of the overhanging branches and the surrounding foliage. The hiker pointed it out to the rest of the group, and they all stood there on the trail, trying to make out what it was. But from that distance, it was impossible to tell. Curious, and feeling a strange sense of unease, the group decided to leave the main trail. They began to carefully make their way down the steep, slippery slope of the ravine, pushing aside the scratchy bushes and stepping over fallen logs. As they got close to a vatch of the stream, the shape in the water began to take a recognizable form. And when they finally stood right at the water's edge, looking down into the shallow flow, they completely froze. They just stood there in absolute stunned silence, staring at the horrific sight. It was the body of a young girl lying face down in the water, pinned beneath a massive, heavy log. The hikers were completely terrified and deeply shaken. They scrambled back up the ravine and ran down the trail to find help. It would take investigators another 3 long years before they would finally understand the dark, twisted, and incredibly sad story behind what those hikers had just stumbled upon in the stream that afternoon. To truly understand how this awful tragedy came to pass, we have to go back to the beginning, to the ordinary, everyday life of a 17-year-old girl named Michelle Avila. Now, almost everyone who knew her just called her Missy. In 1985, Missy was a high school junior living in the working-class community of Arleta, California, which is located in the San Fernando Valley just north of Los Angeles. Physically, young Missy was extremely small. She was under 5 feet tall, and she barely weighed 95 pounds. She had a very delicate, almost fragile frame, but despite her tiny size, Missy had an absolutely massive presence. She was the kind of person who walked into a room and immediately brought a bright, positive energy with her. She was incredibly popular at her high school, and it was easy to see why. For one thing, she was exceptionally beautiful, with long, dark hair, striking features, and a radiant smile. Boys and girls alike were constantly falling over themselves to get her attention, to be near her, or to try and win her affection. But what really made Missy stand out was her genuine kindness. She was not stuck up or arrogant in the slightest. Instead, she was incredibly warm, gentle, and friendly to everyone she met. She did not take herself too seriously, she loved to laugh, and she was always willing to help out a classmate or a friend who was going through a tough time. To anyone looking in from the outside, Missy seemed to have a wonderful, perfect life with a loving family and a huge circle of friends who adored her. But, as is so often the case in true crime, behind this picture-perfect exterior, there were some very dark and troubling things going on. Life for Missy was actually far from perfect. It turns out that a year earlier, during her sophomore year of high school, a completely false and highly malicious rumor had started circulating around the school. This rumor claimed that Missy was secretly sleeping with a bunch of boys who were already in committed, established relationships with other girls at the school. It was a nasty piece of gossip, and it was a complete and total lie. Missy was a sweet, respectful girl who would never dream of doing something like that to anyone. But in the fragile social ecosystem of a high school, facts do not always matter. By the time this rumor made its way to the actual girlfriends of these boys, the damage was already done. These girls believed the rumor completely. They did not bother to ask Missy for her side of the story, nor did they look for any proof. They just wanted revenge. And so, one afternoon after school, as Missy walked out of the building and toward the parking lot, a group of these angry girls ambushed her. They ganged up on her, surrounded her, and began to beat her up. The attack was brutal and relentless. They knocked her to the ground, kicking and punching her, leaving her bruised, battered, and utterly terrified. Missy eventually managed to get away and make her way home, but when her family saw the state she was in, they were absolutely furious. Missy's mother, Irene, and the rest of the family immediately decided that they were not going to let this slide. They went straight to the police and pressed charges against the girl who had led the brutal attack, a teenager named Sonia Bond. But pressing charges did not bring a swift resolution. The legal system moved incredibly slowly. The case dragged on for months and months, stretching through the rest of the school year and through the entire summer. But finally, as the school year started up again and Missy entered her junior year, a court date was set. By October 1st, 1985, Missy was just 1 week away from finally going to court, taking the witness stand, and testifying against Sonia Bond. Naturally, Missy was extremely nervous about this. She was a 17-year-old girl who was going to have to face her attacker in a court of law and recount the terrifying beating she had endured. But deep down, she knew she was doing the right thing. She wanted justice, and she wanted to make sure that nothing like this ever happened to anyone else. On October 1st, which was a Tuesday, Missy came home from school just like she did any other day. She dropped her school books off, sat down with her mother, Irene, and told her that she had plans that afternoon to go out and hang out with some of her friends. This was a very common, routine occurrence for Missy. She had a huge social circle, and she loved spending her free time socializing and being active. Her mother, Irene, did not see any issue with this. She just looked at Missy and told her that she could go, but she had to be back home by 6 o'clock sharp for dinner. Missy smiled, agreed to the curfew, and said she would be back on time. Just a few minutes later, a car pulled up on the street directly outside of Missy's house. Inside the car was 17-year-old Laura Doyle. Laura was one of Missy's very close friends, and she had driven over to pick Missy up so they could go hang out. Laura tapped on the horn to let Missy know she was there. Inside the house, Missy heard the honk, said a quick goodbye to her mother and her brother, ran out the front door, and walked down the pathway to the waiting car. She hopped into the passenger seat, closed the door, and the two girls drove away, chatting and laughing. Fast forward to 6 o'clock that evening. The sun was starting to set, and inside the Avila home, Irene was getting dinner ready. But as she looked at the clock, she noticed that Missy was not home yet. Now, Irene was not immediately plunged into a state of panic. While Missy was generally a very good kid who stayed out of major trouble, she was still a teenager. She loved being out with her friends, and from time to time, she would push the limits of her curfew. It was not uncommon for Missy to stay out past 6 and then walk through the door with a big smile, apologizing and asking for forgiveness. Or, sometimes, she would call her mother right around curfew time and ask if she could have just a little bit more time to hang out. So, when the phone inside the house started ringing shortly after 6 o'clock, Irene felt a wave of relief. She assumed it was Missy calling to apologize for being late or asking to stay out a bit longer. Irene walked over to the phone, picked up the receiver, and said hello. But the voice on the other end of the line was not Missy's. Instead, it was another young girl's voice, and it sounded incredibly strained and nervous. It was Laura Doyle, the girl who had picked Missy up earlier that afternoon. Before Irene could even ask Laura where Missy was, Laura spoke up in a very awkward, hesitant tone. She asked Irene if Missy was home yet. Irene was immediately confused by the question. She replied that Missy was not home, and then she said that she thought Missy was with her. After all, Laura had been the one to pick her up. Why would she be asking if Missy was home? As soon as Irene said this, Laura's tone shifted from awkward to sheer panic. She began to stammer, and then she proceeded to tell Irene a deeply concerning story about what had allegedly happened that afternoon. Laura claimed that after she picked Missy up from her house, the two of them had just driven around town for a while, listening to music and talking, which was a very normal thing for them to do. Eventually, they decided to drive over to Stonehurst Park, a local park where they and their friends frequently gathered to hang out. Laura said that she pulled her car into the Stonehurst Park parking lot and immediately started looking around to see if she could spot any vehicles belonging to people they knew. But as she scanned the parking lot, she did not recognize a single car. Figuring that none of their friends were there, Laura decided there was no point in staying, so she began to turn her car around to leave the park and head back into town. But as she was doing this, Missy suddenly grabbed her arm and told her to wait. Missy pointed out across the parking lot and said that she recognized some guys over there and she wanted to go over and say hello to them. Laura stopped her car and looked in the direction Missy was pointing. On the far side of the parking lot, standing next to a bright blue Chevrolet Camaro, were two guys who looked to be in their late teens or early 20s. Laura looked at them, but she did not recognize either of them. They were total strangers to her. Now, Laura explained to Irene that she was very used to Missy knowing absolutely everyone in town. Missy was so outgoing and popular that she seemed to have acquaintances everywhere they went. But Laura herself was not a very outgoing person, and she felt incredibly uncomfortable with the idea of going over and socializing with two older, strange guys she had never met before. But Missy was really eager to go say hello, and she begged Laura to let her go. So, according to Laura, she relented. She told Missy to go ahead and walk over to say hi, and said that she would find a parking spot, park the car, and then join her in a minute. Missy was thrilled. She hopped out of the passenger seat, closed the door, and began walking across the parking lot toward the blue Camaro, waving and smiling at the two guys who waved back at her. Meanwhile, Laura drove her car into a nearby parking stall. But just as she put the car in park and was preparing to turn off the engine, she happened to look down at her dashboard and noticed that her gas gauge was sitting well below empty. She realized she was practically running on fumes and might not even have enough gas to get home later. She rolled down her window and called out to Missy, who was about halfway across the parking lot by this point. Laura shouted that she needed to go run and get some gas right away, but that she would be right back to join them. Missy turned around, waved, and called back that it was fine, and told her she would see her when she got back. Laura said she put her car back in drive, pulled out of the parking space, and drove out of the Stonehurst Park lot, heading to a nearby gas station to fill up her tank. It only took her about 10 or 15 minutes to get the gas and drive back. But when Laura pulled her car back into the Stonehurst parking lot, she looked over toward the spot where the blue Camaro had been parked. The parking spot was completely empty. The blue Camaro, the two guys, and Missy were all gone. Laura sat in her car, staring at the empty space, feeling a mix of confusion and mild frustration. Since this was 1985, long before the era of cell phones, there was no way for Laura to call or text Missy to find out where she had gone. She couldn't ask if they had gone to get food or if the guys had offered her a ride somewhere else. Laura just sat there, trying to figure out what to do. Eventually, she convinced herself that everything was probably fine. Missy knew those guys, and Missy was smart. She could take care of herself. Surely, those guys would just drive Missy back home when she was ready to go. Even though Laura tried to reassure herself, she still felt uneasy. She decided to drive around the local area for a while, scanning the streets and other parking lots, hoping to spot the distinctive blue Camaro or see Missy walking along the sidewalk. But after driving around for quite some time and finding absolutely no sign of her friend, Laura finally gave up and went back to her own house. She waited until just after 6 o'clock to call Missy's house, knowing that Missy had a strict 6 o'clock curfew and would definitely be home by then if she had been dropped off. But now, speaking to Irene on the phone, Laura realized with horror that Missy had not made it home. Hearing this story, Irene was instantly gripped by a deep, unsettling anxiety. It was completely unlike Missy to just vanish like this, especially with two older guys that her close friend did not even know. But at this point, neither Irene nor Laura felt that they should involve the police just yet. After all, it had only been a short while since her curfew, and they did not want to cause a massive, unnecessary scene if Missy was simply running late or had lost track of time. Instead, Irene and Laura decided to take matters into their own hands. Over the next several hours, they sat by their phones, calling every single friend, classmate, and acquaintance they could think of, asking if anyone had seen Missy or if they knew who the guys with the blue Camaro might be. But person after person answered with the exact same response. They had not seen Missy all day, and they had no idea who those guys were. When phone calls yielded absolutely no results, Irene and Laura met up in person. Despite the darkness and the late hour, they began going door to door, visiting the homes of Missy's friends, knocking on doors, and pleading with anyone who answered for any shred of information. They walked the streets, calling out Missy's name into the night. But as the hours ticked by and midnight came and went, they had found absolutely nothing. No one had seen her, and no one knew where she was. Exhausted, utterly terrified, and completely out of options, Laura and Irene finally decided that there was nothing more they could do that night. They went back to their respective homes, hoping against hope that Missy would walk through the front door in the morning or that the phone would ring with good news. But the next morning, Wednesday, October 2nd, came and went, and there was still no sign of Missy. Her bed had not been slept in, and there was no word from her. Irene knew in her gut that something terrible had happened. She could not wait any longer. That morning, she went straight to the local police department and reported her 17-year-old daughter missing. The police immediately recognized the gravity of the situation. A young girl, just a week away from testifying in a high-profile assault case, had vanished without a trace. They immediately zeroed in on Laura Doyle, since she was the very last person known to have seen Missy alive. Detectives sat down with Laura and began grilling her, going over every single detail of her story. They pressed her for information about the blue Camaro. What year was it? Did it have any dents or custom features? What did the license plate look like? They asked her to describe the two guys in as much detail as possible. What were they wearing? How tall were they? What did their faces look like? Did Missy call them by their names? Laura was visibly distraught. She was crying, shaking, and completely consumed by guilt. She kept telling the detectives how incredibly sorry she was, sobbing that she never should have left Missy alone in that parking lot and that she should have just stayed instead of going to get gas. She tried her absolute best to answer all of their questions, but she explained that she had been quite far away from the guys and their car. She could only provide very basic, vague, physical descriptions. She said they looked like typical local teenagers or young adults, maybe with dark hair, but she couldn't give any specific facial features because she hadn't been paying close attention and was far away. Despite the lack of specific details, the police took the lead seriously. They launched a massive, coordinated search effort. Officers searched Stonehurst Park from top to bottom, looking for any tire tracks, dropped items, or witnesses who might have seen the blue Camaro. They set up checkpoints and began searching the surrounding neighborhoods of Arletta. At the same time, Missy's family, led by her devastated mother Irene, along with Laura and dozens of other volunteer friends and classmates, organized their own massive search parties. They printed out hundreds of flyers with Missy's picture on them and plastered them on utility poles, storefront windows, and car windshields all over the area. They walked through parks, searched vacant lots, and went down into local ravines, calling out Missy's name. But as Tuesday turned into Wednesday and Wednesday turned into Thursday, neither the official police search nor the desperate efforts of the volunteers turned up a single clue. There was no sign of Missy, no sign of the blue Camaro, and no one in the area recalled seeing two older guys fitting that description. It was as if Missy had simply evaporated into thin air. Then, on Friday, October 4th, just 3 days after Missy went missing, her body was found by those hikers in the Angeles National Forest. When the investigators arrived at the stream, they immediately secured the area and began a detailed search for any physical evidence. Just a short distance away from where Missy's body lay in the water, investigators found several discarded cigarette butts, an empty beer bottle, and a pair of men's denim overalls lying on the ground. In reality, these items had absolutely nothing to do with the crime. They had been left there days or even weeks before by random people who had visited the forest to hang out. But because of the incredibly detailed lie that Laura Doyle had told the police about the two older guys and the blue Camaro, these items seemed to perfectly fit her story. The detectives fell right into the trap. They assumed that the two mysterious guys from the park had taken Missy up into the mountains, hung out, smoked cigarettes, drank beer, and then for some unknown reason, murdered her. The police spent the next several months aggressively chasing down leads about blue Camaros in the San Fernando Valley, interviewing dozens of young men who owned similar cars, and trying to trace the origin of the overalls. But because the blue Camaro and the two guys were entirely fictional, the investigation went completely cold. For 3 long years, Missy's family lived in a state of agonizing limbo. They knew she was gone, but they had absolutely no idea who had killed her or why. The police had no solid suspects, and the trail had gone cold. But the absolute worst, most chilling part of this entire 3-year period is what one of Missy's childhood best friends, Karen Severson, did in the weeks and months immediately following the murder. Shortly after Missy's body was recovered and identified, Karen contacted Missy's grieving mother, Irene. Karen put on a masterful performance of pure, unadulterated grief. She fell to her knees, crying hysterically, and told Irene how completely devastated she was by the loss of her best friend. She claimed that she was too afraid and too sad to be alone in her own house, and she asked Irene if she could move into the Avila home. She said she wanted to help support the family during this unimaginably difficult time, and that being in Missy's house would help her feel close to her departed friend. Irene, who had known Karen since she was a little girl and viewed her almost as a second daughter, was deeply touched by this request. She welcomed Kinlist up to her home with open arms, thinking that having Missy's best friend around would help them grieve together and keep Missy's memory alive. For months, Karen Severson lived under the Avila roof. She slept in Missy's actual bed, surrounded by Missy's stuffed animals, her clothes, and her photos. She sat at the family dinner table every single night, eating the food that Irene lovingly prepared. She would sit next to Irene on the couch, comfortingly patting her hand as Irene wept over the loss of her daughter. Karen would even cry along with her, telling her how much she missed Missy and how unfair it was that someone had taken her life. But in reality, Karen's motivation for moving into the house was completely sinister and cold-blooded. She had not moved in out of grief or love. She had moved in to keep close tabs on the police investigation. She wanted to make sure she knew exactly what the detectives were doing, what clues they had, and if they were getting any closer to the truth. Whenever the police would visit the Avila home to give Irene an update on the case, Karen was always there. She would hover in the background, listening to every single detail the detectives shared. And whenever the conversation turned to potential suspects, Karen would actively manipulate the discussion to throw the police off her and Laura's trail. She would suggest other classmates at school, talk about how suspicious certain boys were, and constantly bring up the story of the blue Camaro, keeping the investigation thoroughly derailed. Karen even went so far as to spend hours in the car with Irene, driving around the streets of Arleta and the surrounding communities, pretending to search for any signs of the blue Camaro or the two mysterious guys. She watched Irene cry, she listened to her pour her heart out in absolute agony, and she offered her fake comfort, all while knowing that she was the very person who had held Missy's head under the water and ended her life. But while Karen seemed to have absolutely no conscience, the third girl who had been in the woods that day, 17-year-old Ava Sarambolo, was living in her own personal waking nightmare. For 3 long years, Eva carried the weight of the horrifying secret. She had not participated in the physical attack or the murder, but she had stood there and watched it happen, and she had done nothing to stop it. In the days immediately following the murder, Karen and Laura had cornered Eva. They looked her dead in the eye and delivered a chilling threat. If she ever spoke a single word to anyone, including her parents, her friends, or the police about what had happened in the woods, they would do the exact same thing to her. They told her that they would drag her up to the mountains, beat her, and drown her in the stream, just like they had done to Missy. Knowing what they were capable of, Eva believed them completely. She was absolutely terrified of Karen and Laura. She lived in constant, paralyzing fear that they would find out she had talked, or that they would decide to eliminate her anyway just to be safe. For 3 years, Eva's life fell apart. She couldn't sleep, her grades plummeted, she isolated herself from everyone, and she was constantly looking over her shoulder. Every time she closed eyes, she heard Missy's final, terrifying scream echoing through the trees. She saw the pain of Missy's family on the news, and the guilt began to eat her alive from the inside out. Finally, in 1988, the burden of the secret became too heavy for Eva to bear. She realized she couldn't live like this anymore. She decided that she had to face her fear, no matter the consequences. One afternoon, Eva walked into the local police station. She sat down with a detective, her hands shaking, and told them that she had information about the murder of Michelle Missy Avila. And then she proceeded to tell the detectives the entire shocking and detailed truth about what had actually happened on October 1st, 1985. The detectives listened in absolute stunned silence as Eva dismantled the 3-year-old mystery of the blue Camaro and the 2 older guys. She explained that the entire story was a complete fabrication and that Missy's 2 childhood best friends, Karen Severson and Laura Doyle, were the ones who had planned and executed her murder. The police acted immediately. They gathered their evidence, obtained arrest warrants, and went out to apprehend Karen and Laura. When the news of the arrests broke, Missy's family was completely shattered. Irene could not comprehend the sheer, unimaginable level of betrayal. The girl who had lived in her house, slept in her dead daughter's bed, eaten her food, and pretended to comfort her for months, was actually her daughter's killer. It was a level of deception that seemed almost too evil to be real. During the high-profile trial that followed, the prosecution laid out the entire case using Eva's detailed eyewitness testimony to reconstruct the final hours of Missy's life. The defense tried to downplay their client's roles, but the evidence was overwhelming. The jury saw the calculated nature of the rumors, the staged fight, and the brutal, prolonged method of the killing. Both Karen Severson and Laura Doyle were found guilty of second-degree murder. They were each sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. Decades passed, and the girls who had committed such a heinous crime grew old behind bars. But eventually, the justice system deemed them fit for release. Karen Severson was granted parole and released from prison in December of 2011. Just a year later, in December of 2012, Laura Doyle was also paroled and walked free. Today, both women are out of prison, living their lives, while Missy Avila's life was permanently cut short at just 17 years old. The tragic story of Missy Avila remains one of the most chilling examples of jealousy, betrayal, and cold-blooded deception in the history of Southern California, leaving a lasting, painful, and deep emotional scar on her family, her loved ones, and the entire community of Arleta. But how did we get here? When Karen, Laura, and Missy were growing up, they were inseparable. They lived on the very same street in Arleta, California, which meant they spent virtually every waking hour of their childhood together, sharing jokes, playing in the street, and growing up side by side. They would walk to school side by side, share their lunch boxes, spend weekends at each other's houses, and talk for hours about their dreams for the future. They had built a deep, seemingly unbreakable bond that had survived the test of time through all the minor fights and disagreements that young kids typically have. But as they entered their teenage years and moved into high school, the dynamic between them began to change in a very subtle yet highly destructive way. Missy really blossomed during these teenage years. She grew into an exceptionally beautiful young woman with gorgeous dark hair, perfect skin, and a striking magnetic look that naturally drew people toward her. She was also incredibly popular at school, and she didn't have to try hard to make friends. People were just naturally drawn to her warmth, her gentle nature, and her easy laughter. But for Karen and Laura, the teenage years were much more difficult and painful. They both struggled deeply with their physical appearance and their social standing. Karen grew to be quite large, eventually weighing over 200 pounds, and she felt incredibly self-conscious and awkward in her own body. Laura also struggled with deep insecurities, feeling like she was plain, boring, and completely invisible whenever she stood next to her stunningly beautiful best friend. They began to notice that boys would only talk to them as a way to get closer to Missy. At parties, on the school bus, and in the hallways, Missy was always the center of attention, while Karen and Laura felt like they were nothing more than background props. Over time, as they watched Missy get all the attention, praise, and affection that they desperately craved for themselves, a dark, venomous jealousy began to fester deep inside of them. They started to resent Missy for simply being pretty and liked. And eventually, that resentment curdled into pure, unadulterated hatred. This hatred was what drove them to start that first highly malicious rumor during their sophomore year in 1984. They were the ones who whispered to other classmates that Missy was sleeping with guys who had established girlfriends. They wanted to see her get hurt, to see her cry, and to see her perfect reputation dragged through the mud. And they got exactly what they wanted when Sonia Bond and her group of friends ambushed Missy outside of school and beat her up so badly. But as the months went on, they realized that the beating hadn't actually ruined Missy's life. If anything, it had made people love and protect her even more. Missy's family had pressed charges, and Missy was now viewed as a brave, strong girl who was going to stand up in court and testify against her bullies. This filled Karen and Laura with absolute rage. They felt like Missy hadn't suffered enough, and they began to discuss a much more permanent and horrific solution. They decided that they were going to end her life. Their murder plot was meticulously thought out over several weeks. They knew they couldn't just attack her out of the blue because the police would immediately suspect them given their close connection. They needed a plan that would isolate Missy and lure her to a secluded location without raising any suspicion. So, they decided to start a second rumor. This rumor claimed that Missy was sleeping with boyfriends who belonged to Karen and Laura. They did this very intentionally, knowing that it would start a massive, explosive fight between the three of them. They wanted to create a highly public rift in their friendship so that everyone would see them fighting. And indeed, the rumor worked exactly as they had planned. It led to the screaming match where Karen slapped Missy in the face. This slap was a calculated move to draw a clear line of division between them. But then, they put the next phase of their plan into motion. They knew that Missy was an incredibly forgiving, sweet person who hated conflict and loved her friends deeply. They knew she would be devastated by the thought of her childhood friends hating her, and that she would do anything to fix the relationship. So, after letting the silence drag on for a couple of weeks, Laura approached Missy and pretended to be remorseful. She told Missy that she had realized the rumor was a lie, and she wanted them to be friends again. Missy was overjoyed and immediately forgave her. Then, on the morning of October 1st, Karen contacted Missy to deliver her own tearful, fabricated apology. She told Missy that she was so sorry for slapping her and that she missed her terribly. She suggested that they all meet up that afternoon at Stonehurst Park, just like the old times, to put the past behind them once and for all. Missy, completely blind to the danger she was in, was thrilled at the prospect of her friends loving her again. She agreed to the meeting without a single second of hesitation, utterly unaware that she was walking directly into a deadly trap planned by those she trusted most. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. Some stories you hear seem to sit right on the edge of what we understand. They feel like they could be true, they have all the pieces of a real event, but there's always one detail, one piece of the puzzle that just doesn't fit into our world. Tonight, we're going to look at 3 such stories. They are separated by time and distance, but they all share that one chilling detail that pushes them from the ordinary into something else entirely. We begin on a quiet farm in rural Ohio in the summer of 1921. A young man named Carl Logis stood on the porch of his new farmhouse, looking out at the land he now owned. It was a warm evening, and the crickets were chirping their endless song. He took a deep breath of the country air. This was it. This was everything he had ever worked for. Carl was not a complicated man. He had a simple dream, one that he'd held on to since he was a boy, to own his own piece of land, to work it with his own 2 hands, and to live a quiet, self-sufficient life. And now, against all odds, he had it. The farm was modest, with a small house, a sturdy barn, and a reliable water well. The fields stretched out into the darkness, promising a future of hard work and honest reward. He'd even managed to buy it for a surprisingly low price. The family who sold it to him had been in a huge hurry to leave. They didn't say much about why, just that they were ready for a change, ready for the city. Carl didn't ask too many questions. A good deal was a good deal, and he saw it as his good fortune. He stepped off the porch, a lantern in one hand, its yellow light cutting a small circle in the deep darkness of the night. He had a pistol holstered on his hip, more out of habit than any real sense of danger. It was time for his final check of the animals before turning in for the night. His horses and cattle were his livelihood, and he took their care seriously. As he walked across the yard, the crunch of his boots on the dry soil was the only sound besides the crickets. He looked back at his little farmhouse, its windows dark, and then ahead towards the large, dark shape of the barn. He felt a swell of pride. This was all his. He was alone out here, master of his own small world. And then, the feeling came. It was sudden and sharp. A prickling sensation on the back of his neck, the kind that makes you feel like you've been caught doing something you shouldn't. He felt with absolute certainty that he was being watched. He stopped dead in his tracks. But that was impossible. He lived completely alone. His nearest neighbor was miles away. There were no roads nearby that people would be walking on this late at night. It was just him, his land, and his animals. Instinctively, he whipped around, raising the lantern high. The light swung wildly, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to jump and flee. He scanned the open fields, the line of trees in the distance, the area around the farmhouse. Nothing. Just the empty, dark landscape. He listened intently, holding his breath. He heard nothing but the wind rustling through the tall grass. His practical mind immediately started searching for a rational explanation. A predator, maybe? A coyote or a fox? He looked around again. The night was peaceful. The crickets hadn't stopped their chirping, which they usually did if a large predator was near. And the previous owners hadn't mentioned any problems with dangerous animals in the area. He shook his head, a small, frustrated sigh escaping his lips. He was just being paranoid. That had to be it. He was new to this property, new to living so isolated. Every little sound, every shadow was magnified by the darkness and the silence. He told himself to calm down, that he was just letting his imagination get the better of him. "Go check your animals and go to bed," he muttered to himself. "Everything is fine." He turned and continued his walk to the barn, his pace a little quicker than before. He slid open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside. The familiar smells of hay and livestock filled the air, and the gentle sounds of the animals shifting in their stalls were comforting. He set about his work, topping off their water, checking their feed, making sure everything was secure for the night. He busied himself for a few minutes, his mind focused on the simple, repetitive tasks. For a little while, he managed to forget about that strange, unsettling feeling he'd had outside. He was finishing up, giving one of his horses a final pat on the neck, when the feeling returned. This time, it was even stronger. It was an intense, piercing feeling, as if a pair of eyes were boring right into his back. He stood frozen for a moment, then slowly turned to look out the open barn door. The yard was empty, bathed in the pale light of the moon. He couldn't see anything out of the ordinary. He scanned the dark corners of the barn itself, the hayloft above. Nothing. Still, the feeling persisted. He was not alone. He tried to tell himself again that it was just his nerves, but deep down, a cold knot of fear was tightening in his stomach. The walk back to the farmhouse, which a few minutes ago had been a source of pride, now seemed like a long and treacherous journey through enemy territory. But he couldn't stay in the barn all night. He took a deep breath to steel his resolve. He picked up his lantern, and his other hand instinctively went to the gun on his hip, his fingers resting on the worn leather of the holster. He stepped out of the barn and began walking quickly towards the house, his head on a swivel, scanning the darkness on either side of him. He was about halfway across the yard when a flicker of movement caught his eye. It was on the far side of his property, out in the distance. He stopped, his heart pounding in his chest. He raised his lantern, aiming the beam in that direction. The light was weak at that distance, but it was enough. He could clearly see a figure. Someone was standing on his land. They were just standing there, perfectly still, a tall, pale silhouette against the dark fields. It looked almost white in the dim light. For a second, Carl was too shocked to move. He just stood there, holding the lantern, staring at this silent intruder. The figure was standing near his water well. Finally, his shock gave way to anger. "Hey!" he yelled, his voice cutting through the quiet of the night. "Who are you? What are you doing on my property?" The figure didn't respond. It didn't even seem to flinch. It just stood there, seemingly staring right back at him. Then, slowly, it turned and began to move. It wasn't walking or running. It was more like it was gliding, moving away from Carl and towards the water well. That's when Carl's fear and anger boiled over. This was a trespasser. This must have been who was watching him earlier. Were they trying to rob him? Scope out his property? He wasn't going to let them get away. He drew his gun from its holster and started running towards the figure, shouting for them to stop. As he ran, the lantern in his other hand swung back and forth, making the light unsteady. The white figure seemed to flicker in and out of view between the bouncing shadows. He was closing the distance, but the figure was moving with an unnatural speed. He lost sight of it for a moment behind a small rise in the ground. By the time he reached the water well, panting and out of breath, the person was gone. They had just vanished. He stood there, scanning the area in every direction. There was nowhere for them to have gone so quickly. The fields were wide open. There were no trees or buildings to hide behind. It was as if they had just dissolved into the night air. Carl didn't know what to think. Was this person playing games with him? Had they circled back around to his house while he was chasing them? The uncertainty was terrifying. All he could think to do was yell out into the darkness. He warned them that he had a gun and he wasn't afraid to use it. He told them to get off his property and never come back. But his threats were met with nothing but silence. The crickets had stopped chirping now. The night was eerily still. For a long time, Carl just stood there by the well, his gun still in his hand, his eyes straining to see any sign of movement in the darkness. But the figure never reappeared. Eventually, the cold night air began to seep into his bones. He knew he couldn't stand out here all night. With one last paranoid look around, he turned and ran the rest of the way to his farmhouse. He burst through the door, slammed it shut, and slid the bolt home. The next morning, with the sun streaming through his windows, the events of the previous night felt like a bad dream. Carl tried to rationalize it. It must have been a local prankster, or maybe a neighbor who was too shy to introduce themselves properly. Or perhaps it was a would-be thief who got scared off when Carl shouted and drew his gun. Whatever it was, he told himself it was a one-time thing. He had stood his ground, and they wouldn't be back. He desperately wanted to believe that. But he was wrong. That night, and almost every single night for the next year, the same thing happened. Around 9:30 p.m., just as Carl would be heading out to the barn for his final check, he would see the figure. It was always there, standing at a distance, a pale shape watching him from the edge of his property. It never got any closer, and he could never make out any features. It was just a silent, ever-present observer. Every night, Carl would scream at it, curse at it, tell it to leave. He would run towards it, his gun in his hand. One night, in a fit of rage and desperation, he even fired a shot in its direction. But every single time, the outcome was the same. The figure would turn, glide silently towards the water well, and then, right around that area, it would simply vanish. As the months wore on, Carl's initial anger and fear slowly turned into a kind of weary resignation. He wanted to believe it was just a persistent trespasser, someone with a strange obsession who was impossibly good at hiding. But he knew deep down that wasn't the case. Though he was not a superstitious man, he couldn't deny what he was seeing. The way it moved, the way it disappeared into thin air, it had to be a ghost. What else could it be? And then he would remember the family who sold him the farm, how eager they were to leave, how they practically gave the place away. He started to think that maybe their hurry to get out had something to do with his nightly visitor. But as terrifying as it was to live with a ghost on his property, Carl clung to one fact. It was predictable. It appeared at the same time, in the same area, and it never did anything more than just watch. It never came near the house, never bothered his animals. It was a frightening, but ultimately harmless, part of his new normal. He learned to live with it. That is, until the 1st of August 1922, almost exactly 1 year to the day after he had bought the farm. On that day, something changed. Carl went out to water his horses and cattle just as he did every day. But this time, they wouldn't drink. They shied away from the troughs, snorting and stamping their feet nervously. They acted as if the water was poisoned. Carl was baffled. It was the same water from the same well they had been drinking for a year without any issue. He cupped his hands and tasted it himself. It tasted fine to him, clean and fresh. But the animals were adamant. Something was wrong with the water. He realized the only way to solve the problem was to clean out the well. He would have to drain all the existing water, scrub the inside, and let it refill with fresh, clean groundwater. So, Carl went over to the well, the very spot where the ghostly figure disappeared every night. He set up the pump and began the long, laborious process of draining it. As the water level slowly dropped, he peered down into the dark opening. He saw something. There was something large at the bottom of the well, something that had been hidden deep beneath the surface of the water. As the water level got lower and lower, the object became clearer. It wasn't a rock or a piece of old equipment. It was a tangled mess of what looked like old clothes and bones. His blood ran cold. He knew immediately what he had to do. He stopped the pump and ran to get the sheriff. The discovery at the bottom of the well reopened a 5-year-old cold case. It turned out that before Carl, and even before the family who sold him the farm, the property had been owned by a man named Frank Lerman. Frank had employed several farmhands, including a young man named Henry Lipenstick. One day, 5 years earlier, Henry had simply vanished. He had no family or close friends in the area, so most people just assumed he had packed up and left town to find work elsewhere. But one of Frank's neighbors had her doubts. She went to the sheriff at the time and told him that she didn't think Henry had just left. She thought Frank Lerman might have had something to do with his disappearance. She said the two of them argued constantly, usually about money. She could hear them shouting at each other from her own property. She said there was real, palpable tension between them. The sheriff had tried to investigate her claim. He went to speak with Frank, but just as the investigation was getting started, Frank abruptly sold the farm and moved away without a forwarding address. With no body and no real evidence of foul play, the sheriff had no choice but to close the case. Until now. 5 years later, the body found at the bottom of Carl Lugise's well was identified as Henry Lipenstick. His remains were badly decomposed, mostly skeletal, but identification was confirmed. An autopsy revealed that Henry had died from blunt force trauma to the head. His death was officially ruled a homicide. Frank Lerman was tracked down, arrested, and charged with second-degree murder. He was found guilty, but the conviction didn't stick. After only 7 months, his charges were dropped due to insufficient evidence from so long ago, and he was released. But there was one more detail, one final, chilling piece to the story. When they carefully removed Henry's remains from the well to give him a proper burial, they noticed he was still wearing a watch on his skeletal wrist. The watch was broken, its hands frozen in time. It had stopped at 9:35 p.m. This was almost precisely the time, every single night for a year, that Carl Logis had seen that white, ghostly figure running towards the well before disappearing. After Henry Lipenstick's body was finally recovered and laid to rest in a proper grave, Carl Logis never saw the white figure on his farm ever again. The haunting was over. Our next story takes us forward in time a bit to the winter of 1933 and to a grand castle in southern Poland. Inside one of the castle's many lavish sitting rooms, a young nobleman named Anton Holberg was hosting a party for his friends. The room was filled with laughter and the smoke from expensive cigars. Anton, already quite drunk, was attempting to pour another round of drinks. He weaved his way back towards the card table where his friends were playing blackjack, but he stumbled, spilling most of the liquor onto a priceless carpet. Instead of being embarrassed, he just found it hilarious. So did his friends. They all roared with laughter as he clumsily picked up the nearly empty glasses from the floor. As a joke, he continued to the table and handed out the empty cups, and his friends, equally drunk and jovial, played along pretending to toast with them. The dealer for the next round began to pass out the cards. And it was in that moment that a loud, groaning creak echoed down from the ceiling right above them. The sound was so distinct and so loud that it cut through the noise of the party. Everyone stopped what they were doing and looked up. A moment of silence fell over the room. In that sudden quiet, Anton grinned and waved a dismissive hand. "Oh boy," he said with a chuckle. "That's just the monk." Most of his friends at the table knew what he was talking about. They had all heard Anton's favorite story about the castle being haunted by a so-called hooded monk. But there was one new friend in the group that night who hadn't heard the tale. He looked at Anton with a confused expression. "The monk? What are you talking about?" The other friends groaned playfully. They knew what was coming. Anton's eyes lit up. He loved telling this story. He turned to his new friend and launched into his well-rehearsed tale. He explained that when he first took ownership of the castle, he was told by the previous owners that the entire estate was his to enjoy, with one exception. There was a single bedroom on the second floor that was to remain locked and untouched at all times. The reason, they claimed, was that the room was haunted by the malevolent spirit of a hooded monk who patrolled it endlessly. Anton admitted to his friends that he had always heeded the warning. He had never once set foot inside that room. He had dozens of other bedrooms, so he didn't need it, but more than that, a part of him actually believed the story might be true. He liked the idea that his grand castle had a genuine, terrifying secret. He concluded his story by pointing a finger towards the ceiling. "And that bedroom," he said with a dramatic flair, "is right above us. So maybe that creak we just heard really was the monk." Usually, his friends would just humor him and move on. It was just a silly ghost story Anton liked to tell. But tonight, the new friend's reaction changed the dynamic. He stared at Anton in disbelief. "Wait a minute," he said. "You're telling me you own this entire castle, but there's a room in it that you've never been inside just because of some old ghost story? Are you serious?" As he said it out loud, the other friends started to see it from a new perspective. It did sound a bit cowardly when you put it like that. Suddenly, Anton's fun ghost story made him seem weak. They all started to pile on. "Yeah, Anton, what's the deal?" "It's your castle." "You can't be scared of one little room." Anton's cheerful mood quickly soured. He tried to brush it off, telling them to forget it and get back to the card game. But his friends wouldn't let it go. They were drunk and looking for some fun, and now they had a target. The goading turned into a dare. "You know what you should do, Anton? You should spend the night in that room. Tonight. Prove to us you're not afraid." At first, Anton refused. But his friends were relentless, and his drunken pride was on the line. He couldn't stand them thinking he was a coward in his own home. Finally, he slammed his hand on the table. "Fine," he declared. "I'll do it. I'll spend the night in there. I'll show you all it's just a stupid story." He probably assumed that by the time the party ended, everyone would be too drunk and tired to remember the dare. He figured he could just slip away to his own comfortable bedroom and no one would be the wiser. But his friends did not forget. When the card game finally wound down and it was time for everyone to go to bed, they all stood up and looked at Anton. "All right, Anton," one of them said with a grin. "Time to go to your new bedroom. We'll walk you up." Trapped by his own bravado, Anton had no choice but to lead the procession. The group of men, some stumbling, made their way out of the sitting room, up the grand staircase to the second floor, and down a long, dark hallway. They stopped in front of a heavy, ancient-looking wooden door. This was it. The forbidden room. Anton nervously fumbled with the old iron key he had retrieved. He put it in the lock and turned it. The mechanism groaned in protest, but it opened. Before pushing the door open, he turned to look at his friends one last time, a silent plea in his eyes. He was hoping they would let him off the hook. But they just stared back, their faces a mixture of curiosity and drunken amusement. They weren't backing down. "Go on," one of them urged. Anton sighed, turned back to the door, and pushed it open. He and his friends peered inside. For the first time, Anton laid eyes on the room he had avoided for so long. It was anticlimactic. It was just a bedroom, filled with old, heavy furniture that was covered in a thick layer of dust and draped with cobwebs. It looked like it hadn't been touched in 100 years. It was creepy, but it just looked like an old, unused room. "All right, get in there," his friend said, nudging him forward. Anton gave them a weak smile. "Okay, I'll see you all in the morning," he said, trying to sound confident. He stepped over the threshold into the dusty room. He then pulled the door shut behind him. His friends on the other side heard the distinct sound of the key turning in the lock. Anton was locking himself in for the night. Satisfied, his friends all walked back down the hall to their own guest rooms and went to sleep. Several hours later, in the dead of night, the silence of the castle was shattered. A terrible, blood-curdling scream ripped through the air. It was a sound of pure terror, and it was clearly coming from the haunted bedroom where Anton was sleeping. His friends were jolted awake. They scrambled out of their beds and ran into the hallway, their hearts pounding. They rushed down the hall to the locked door and started banging on it, yelling Anton's name. They tried the handle, but it was locked solid, just as he had left it. "Anton! Are you okay?" "Open the door!" they shouted. But there was no response. The screaming had stopped as abruptly as it had started. Now, there was only a dead, heavy silence coming from inside the room. A wave of dread washed over them. The drunken dare didn't seem so funny anymore. That scream had sounded real. It was the sound of someone in mortal danger. Something was terribly wrong. They had to get in there. They threw their shoulders against the heavy oak door, but it wouldn't budge. They took a few steps back and rammed it together, again and again. The old wood splintered and groaned until finally, with a loud crack, the door flew off its hinges and crashed into the room. They stumbled inside, their eyes frantically searching the darkness. And then they saw him. The sight that met them was one they would never forget. Anton was lying on the bed, flat on his back. His eyes were wide open, staring up at the ceiling with a look of unimaginable horror frozen on his face. He was dead. As they cautiously approached the bed, they saw the only sign of what might have happened to him. Around his neck, there was a thin, red line. It looked like a ligature mark, the kind of mark left by a rope or a wire. But there was no rope. There was no wire. There was nothing in the room that could have made such a mark. The windows were sealed shut from years of neglect. The door had been locked from the inside. There was no sign of a struggle. Nothing was out of place, except for Anton, lying dead on the bed with that inexplicable red line around his throat. The authorities were called, and they conducted a thorough investigation. They searched the room from top to bottom. They confirmed what the friends already knew. The room had been sealed from the inside. There was no way anyone could have gotten in or out. They never found any kind of rope, cord, or weapon that could have caused the mark on Anton's neck. An autopsy was performed, but the medical examiner was baffled. They couldn't determine a cause of death. He hadn't been poisoned, and there were no other injuries. He was just dead. The case was a complete mystery. But it becomes even stranger when you learn the full story of the hooded monk, not just the watered-down version Anton used to tell at parties. The complete legend, passed down for centuries, was much more specific. The story went that an evil monk had been executed in that very room hundreds of years ago, and his vengeful spirit remained, forever, trapped inside. The legend also contained a specific warning. If anyone dared to spend the night in that room, the ghost of the monk would appear and strangle them to death with a thin rope. The thin red mark found on Anton Holberg's neck was a perfect match for the legend's description. To this day, his death remains officially unexplained. A young man who died alone, in a locked room, seemingly at the hands of a ghost. Our final story takes us back to the very beginning of the 20th century, to southeastern Wales. Around 1 a.m. on Sunday, the 20th of January, 1907, a 57-year-old salt merchant named Samuel Hughes was dozing off on a passenger train. Sam was bone-tired. He had been working for nearly 24 hours straight. He had left his home in the small town of Blackwood early the previous morning and taken the train an hour south to the larger town of Newport, where he conducted most of his business. He had spent all of Saturday, from dawn until late into the night, meeting with clients and managing his accounts. Now, finally, he was on the last train home. He could barely keep his eyes open, his head lolling with the rhythm of the train. All he could think about was getting home, greeting his wife, and collapsing into his own warm bed. He had made this trip hundreds of times. He knew the route by heart. Even in his exhausted state, he could feel the train begin to slow down, and his body knew it was time. On autopilot, he gathered his bags, stood up, and shuffled out of his carriage and onto the platform. The train hissed and then pulled away, its red lights disappearing into the dark. Sam stood on the platform for a moment, waiting for the familiar sight of his local station. But, as his tired eyes adjusted, a cold dread washed over him. This wasn't his station. This wasn't Blackwood. In his exhausted stupor, he had gotten off the train one stop too early. He let out a groan of frustration. The train was gone. This was 1907. There wouldn't be another one until morning. He didn't have a phone to call a cab. He was stranded, in the middle of the night, in a town he didn't recognize. He had two choices. He could try to find an inn and spend the night, or he could try to walk home. He wasn't even sure how far away Blackwood was from here. First things first, he needed to find someone to ask for help. He stepped off the deserted platform and started walking towards a few faint lights he could see in the distance. He didn't have high hopes of finding anyone out and about at this hour, in what was clearly a very small rural town. But to his surprise, he hadn't walked for more than a few minutes when he saw another person approaching an intersection up ahead. As they got closer, he saw the uniform and realized it was a police officer on his nightly patrol. A wave of relief washed over Sam. He flagged the officer down. The officer was a bit suspicious at first, seeing a well-dressed man with luggage wandering around in the middle of the night. Sam quickly explained his foolish mistake, how he'd gotten off the train at the wrong stop. He asked the officer if there was a place to stay nearby, or if it was possible to walk to Blackwood. The officer was friendly and helpful. He told Sam that there were a couple of inns in town, but if he was feeling up to it, Blackwood was only about an hour's walk away. The officer said if it were him, he'd probably just make the walk and get home. Sam thought about it. As tired as he was, the thought of sleeping in his own bed was too tempting. He decided to walk. He asked the officer for directions. The officer explained that it was a straight shot. He just needed to follow the main road for about an hour. He would eventually come to a bridge. Once he crossed that bridge, he would see signs for Blackwood. It was simple. Sam thanked the officer profusely, picked up his bags, and set off down the dark road, heading for home. Several hours later, a little after 3 in the morning, Sam's wife Bess was wide awake in their home in Blackwood. She was sitting in a chair by the window, staring out into the darkness. She was worried. She knew Sam had a long day, but he should have been home by now. He was usually very predictable. For him to be this late without any word was highly unusual, and a knot of anxiety was tightening in her stomach. She sat there, listening to the old house creak and groan, her mind imagining all sorts of terrible things that could have happened. And then she heard it. It was Sam's voice, calling out her name from outside. Bess. I'm home! It sounded like he was just out front. He must have seen the lights on in the house and known she was waiting up for him. Bess was overcome with relief. He was safe. Her husband was home. She grabbed a candle, her hands trembling slightly, and hurried to the front door to let him in. She unlatched the door and pulled it open, a happy greeting on her lips. But the words died in her throat. It wasn't her husband. Sam was nowhere in sight. Instead, standing on her porch, just inches away from her, was a dark figure. It was tall and cloaked in black, and it was just standing there, silent and still, looking right at her. Bess froze. But strangely, she wasn't afraid. A bizarre sense of calm washed over her as she looked at this strange apparition. She didn't know what it was or what it wanted, but she felt no sense of threat. She just stood there, holding her candle, staring at the figure. And as she looked closer, she noticed a detail. On its head, the figure was wearing a black silk hat. Her husband Sam owned a hat just like it. In fact, he wore it almost every day. She knew for a fact he had been wearing it that morning when he left for Newport. She stared at this figure, wearing what looked like her husband's hat, and remembered hearing her husband's voice just moments before. She didn't imagine it. He had called to her. And then, Bess blinked. And in that instant, the figure was gone. It had simply vanished. The hat, the cloak, all of it. Her porch was empty. Now, the fear hit her. The calm was gone, replaced by a chilling terror. Had she imagined it all? What was happening? She thought maybe Sam was outside, hurt. Maybe he had called to her and then collapsed. She ran out of the house, holding her candle, and started searching the property, calling his name over and over. But Sam wasn't there. After a frantic search, she went back inside, her mind reeling. She sat up for a few more hours, waiting and watching, but Sam never came home. Eventually, exhausted and confused, she went to bed. When Bess woke up late the next afternoon, Sam still wasn't home. The bright sunlight made the strange vision from the night before seem even more unreal. She told herself she must have been half asleep, that she had dreamt the whole thing. Sam was fine, she reassured herself. He probably just got delayed in Newport and would be home soon. As she was trying to convince herself that everything was okay, she heard a sharp knock on the front door. For a moment, her heart leaped with hope. Maybe it was Sam. She rushed to the door and opened it. It was a police officer, the same one who had spoken to Sam the night before. He had a grim expression on his face, and he removed his helmet. "Ma'am," he said softly, "I have some terrible news." He explained what had happened. The night before, Sam had followed his directions, walking along the dark road towards Blackwood. He had made it all the way to the bridge that the officer had told him about. He was so close to home. But somehow, either because he was so exhausted or because it was so dark, he had made a fatal misstep. He had fallen from the bridge. His body had been discovered that morning. As Bess listened, her world collapsing around her, her mind inexplicably flashed back to the dark figure on her porch. Without thinking, she asked the officer a strange question. "What time do you think he died?" The officer paused, a bit taken aback, but then he answered. He said that based on when he had spoken to Sam and how long the walk to the bridge would have taken, they estimated that he likely fell sometime around 3 in the morning. The time was a perfect match. That was right around when she had heard Sam's voice and seen the figure. And then she thought of the hat. That distinct black silk hat. She had to know. Her voice was barely a whisper when she asked, "When you found him, was he wearing his hat?" The officer looked confused by the question, but answered it. "No, ma'am," he said. "He wasn't wearing a hat at all. We couldn't find one at the scene." In that moment, Bess knew. As heartbreaking as it was, she knew exactly what she had seen on her porch. It hadn't been a dream or a figment of her imagination. Who or what she saw, the dark figure in the cloak wearing her husband's black silk hat, had been Sam's spirit. He had fallen from the bridge and died, and his soul had come home one last time to say goodbye. The figure wearing his hat was his way of letting her know it was really him. Bess would go on to tell her story to a local reporter, and the tale of the ghostly goodbye was printed in newspapers all across Wales, a haunting reminder that sometimes love is strong enough to cross even the final boundary between life and death. The strange thing about stories like these is that no matter how much evidence you uncover, one piece never seems to fit. A ghost seen at the exact moment of death. A locked room with no escape. A figure returning home after falling into darkness. Maybe some mysteries were never meant to be solved. Thanks for watching, and if you're brave enough for one more story tonight, there's a playlist waiting for you right now. Until next time. When you think of Russia, your thoughts most likely go to the major cities that are located on the western edge of the country, which is the region of the country that is geographically located in Europe. You may visualize the onion domes that are so famous in Moscow or the streets of St. Petersburg, which are so historically significant. That is correct, by the way. The majority of the population are located there, and the majority of the historical events that we read about took place there. On the other hand, the portion of Russia known as European Russia accounts for only roughly 23% of the overall area of the country. A vast, untamed, and frequently cruel swath of territory that extends all the way to the Pacific Ocean makes up the remaining 77% of the land of the United States. A region known as Siberia is located here. An understatement would be to suggest that Siberia is a landmass. The vastness of this globe, which is comprised of lush woods, towering mountain ranges, and icy tundra, is approximately 50 times larger than the entirety of the United Kingdom. Extremism is the word that best defines what is going on here. One of the most difficult obstacles to overcome is the weather. Over the course of a whole year, the average temperature across the entirety of Siberia is consistently rather close to freezing. Because it can reach temperatures that are unfathomable throughout the winter, it is considered to be one of the coldest spots on the globe where people live. Moreover, the weather is not the only thing that is attempting to take your life. Just as daunting is the wildlife that can be found in Siberia. The grizzly bears that are found in North America are of the same species as the enormous brown bears that you have. Gray wolves can be found in packs, and some of them can grow to reach almost 200 pounds in weight, making them dwarf any other wolves you could encounter in other places. And then there is the Siberian tiger, which is a predator that is both extremely intelligent and extremely powerful. One of the few creatures on Earth that has been documented to intentionally hunt humans, sometimes even for vengeance, these tigers are among the few that have been known to do so. There is a well-known tale that dates back to 1997 about a hunter who accidentally shot and injured a Siberian tiger. This tiger did not pass away. As an alternative, it followed the hunter all the way back to his cabin, waited for him to emerge from the building, and then proceeded to murder and consume him. As you might have guessed, the number of people who choose to reside in Siberia is relatively low. Given the enormous extent of the area, the population is extremely small. On the other hand, for a particular category of individuals, the very same traits that scare away the majority of people are the precise things that attract them. Siberia is one of the few truly wild areas on Earth, and it is a final frontier that needs to be experienced by those who are interested in taking on new challenges and traveling. Additionally, a young man from the United States by the name of Colin Madsen was one of these daring individuals. Growing up in Missouri, Colin was a member of a family that was both prosperous and caring. Since he was a little boy, he had a deep fascination with the natural world. He enjoyed going on hikes, camping, and simply being outside in the greenery. When he was younger, he began reading about Siberia at some time in his life. After looking at photographs of its wild and unspoiled beauty, he became utterly enthralled by the place. What he was interested in was not merely a passing curiosity. In the depths of it, he dove. He started learning about the history of Russia and Siberia, and he even taught himself how to speak Russian well. It wasn't enough for him to simply travel to Siberia. He wanted to live there and completely submerge himself in the culture. Furthermore, in the year 2013, when Colin was 22 years old, he was able to turn his desire into success. Irkutsk, which is located in the middle of the world, became his new home after he packed his belongings, said his goodbyes to his family in Missouri, and went there. Irkutsk is one of the few large population concentrations in the southeast region of Siberia, and it is situated directly on the shore of Lake Baikal. The natural wonder that is Lake Baikal is, in and of itself, it is the freshwater lake that is both the oldest and the deepest in the world. It is so deep and clear that in certain areas you can see more than 100 feet below the surface. The idea that Colin had for his new life in Siberia was straightforward but nonetheless grandiose. In order to further his education, he would enroll in a university, and in his leisure time, he would spend it exploring the wilderness that he had fantasized about for such a long time. Moreover, over a period of time, everything proceeded precisely in accordance with that plan. As soon as he was accepted into the local branch of Moscow State Linguistic University in Irkutsk, he was able to immediately form a group of friends who shared his enthusiasm for the great outdoors. It was a group of individuals who, just like him, were anxious to explore the immense wilderness that was Siberia. The life that Colin had always desired was the life that he had from the time he came in 2013 until the year 2016. Not only did he excel in his academic pursuits, but he also enthusiastically spent endless weekends and holidays going on hikes and camping in the mountains and forests that encircled Lake Baikal. In addition, he was not only a tourist who went hiking for fun. After gaining such a deep understanding of the area and becoming proficient in negotiating its difficult terrain, he decided to begin working for a local group that was dedicated to charitable causes. Their objective was to establish and label new hiking paths so that others might enjoy them in a secure environment. As a result, Colin was essentially venturing into undiscovered area, so paving the way for new routes through the Siberian wilderness. In a setting where there was very little room for error, he was a knowledgeable individual who was regarded for his abilities and his composed approach to surviving in the environment. Because of this, when his family received the news in 2016 about what had occurred to him, it was something that they simply were unable to comprehend. In the month of March, in the year 2016, Colin and 3 of his closest hiking companions came to the conclusion that it was time for new adventures. As well as being an American, one of the pals was also Russian, and the other 2 were American. In the same way as Colin was, all of them were seasoned outdoor enthusiasts. Following the examination of maps, they settled on a destination, which turned out to be the peak of a mountain that was referred to as Love Peak. They were a few hours' drive away from their home base in Irkutsk, which was located in a little settlement named Arshan. Love Peak was located there. Now, when compared to other hikes in Siberia, this one was not particularly challenging at all. There were some steep sections on the trail that led up to the peak, but it was fairly well defined and had been walked quite a bit. Every single one of the four men, including Colin, had hiked it on multiple occasions in the past. It was a trip that was both familiar and reasonably risk-free. Being seasoned hikers in Siberia, however, meant that they were aware of one thing above all others: you should never show disrespect to the natural environment. Without proper preparation, even the most straightforward hike could turn out to be fatal. Anywhere could be a potential danger. As a result, they were very serious about their preparations. In order to rent a tiny rustic cabin at the foot of the mountain, the intention was to drive to Arshan and make the trip there. Using this cottage as their base camp would be their plan. Before beginning their ascent early the following morning, it would provide them with a location to get themselves organized, check their equipment, and get a full night's sleep the night before. Therefore, they made a reservation in advance for one of the cute tiny cabins that were tucked away in the woods and were located close to the trailhead. A few days later, on the morning of March 27th, Colin and his three friends began the journey to the village of Arshan by embarking on a westbound journey from Irkutsk. They packed their car with all of their equipment and supplies and began their journey. Upon their arrival, they made a brief detour at a nearby store to purchase some water and food for the last minute, and then they proceeded to make their way to the cabin that they had leased. Exactly as they had anticipated, it was a straightforward location. It was essentially a single room with a few beds, which was just enough to provide refuge from the chilly environmental conditions of Siberia. Inside, there was no plumbing available. In the event that you required the use of the restroom, there was a modest outhouse located a short distance away from the cabin. The four companions made themselves comfortable, claimed their mattresses, and immediately began arranging their belongings in preparation for the hike that would take place the next day. They continued to converse, eat, and simply take pleasure in each other's presence as they sat around. The atmosphere was upbeat and full of excitement for the ascent that was still to come. They came to a conclusion regarding their strategy, which stated that they would get up at 5 in the morning to complete their last preparations, with the intention of getting on the route and climbing to the summit of Love Peak no later than 7 o'clock. They were well aware that in order to make that happen, they needed to get some rest. Therefore, at 2 in the morning, they ensured that the lights in the cabin were turned out, and then all four of their companions went to bed. It was precisely 5 o'clock in the morning when the alarms went off, which was 3 hours later. At that moment, one of the companions reached over and turned on the light in the cabin. And at that particular moment, it was manifestly obvious that something was extremely, extremely wrong. He was not in his bed at the time. It was not until later that there was a feeling of panic. After looking over at his vacant bed, the other three buddies noticed that all of his personal possessions were still at the location where they had been left. All of his belongings, including his bag, his hiking gear, his wallet, and his phone, were arranged in an orderly fashion exactly where he had left them the previous evening. It was the first and most reasonable assumption that he must have gotten up a little bit earlier than usual and sneaked out of the cabin in a stealthy manner. It is possible that he needed to use the outhouse, or it is also possible that he simply desired to go outdoors and take a breath of fresh air. It was their assumption that he had simply been quiet in order to avoid waking them up and that he would return at any moment. As a result, the three buddies began to get ready for the day, disregarding Colin's absence from these preparations. They anticipated that he would return at any moment and go back through the door. Despite the fact that he had gone for a little walk before morning in order to stretch his legs, he was aware of the plan. He had a strict adherence to the plans. Without a doubt, he would return by 7 o'clock, which was the time that they had agreed upon for their departure. However, as the minutes ticked by steadily, a feeling of dread started to make its way into the room. There was a passing of 5:30. Then it is 6 o'clock. Next, it is 6:30. Colin has not been seen or heard from since. It was not a phone call. He had not sent a text message. Just now, he had disappeared. Concerns began to arise among the friends. Colin's behavior was utterly out of character in this regard. It was he who was accountable, the one who was an adept navigator. Without informing anyone of his intended destination, he would not just disappear into the night in the middle of the Siberian wilderness without a known destination. In no way did it make any sense at all. 7 o'clock in the morning, which was the time that they had agreed to leave, Colin was still absent. With the passage of time, the original feeling of worry had developed into a full-blown concern. The region immediately surrounding the cabin was the subject of a speedy search that his friends conducted. They inquired about his name. The outhouse was examined once more by them. As the frost covered the ground, they searched for any footprints that might have been left behind. And still, they discovered nothing. It appeared as though he had simply exited the cabin and vanished from existence. It was as if he had passed away. They were aware that they needed to seek assistance at that point. Simply waiting around was no longer an option for them. A brief message was written by them before they left, and it was affixed to the front door of the cabin for safekeeping. The sender of the message was Colin. The note read something along the lines of, "If you come back and see this, we've gone to get help. We're looking for you. Please stay here or let someone know you're safe." After posting the note, the three friends left the cabin and went straight to the nearest police station in Arshan to let them know that their friend was missing. It was taken quite seriously by the local police department. Unusual was the disappearance of a young and experienced American outdoorsman who had been out in the wilderness. Almost immediately, they started a comprehensive search operation. An enormous search area was conducted, which encompassed the thick forest that surrounded the settlement of Arshan and extended all the way up the slopes of Love Peak itself. There were scores of local volunteers, including some individuals from the group that Colin had worked with in the past, who participated in the massive effort that was undertaken by law enforcement authorities, professional rescue teams, and other volunteers. Every single one of them was really worried since they were aware of how skilled he was. When Colin's family returned to the United States, they were confronted with the phone call that every parent dreads receiving. It was reported to them that their son had gone missing in Siberia. In response, they expressed complete and utter astonishment. A Colin? Is it lost? It appeared to be impossible. It turned out to be the young man who had spent years researching the environment in question. The individual in question was not a careless traveler who strayed off the path. It was almost as if he was an expert in the area. They made frantic efforts to obtain information, but in light of the fact that they were located thousands of miles away, they felt absolutely useless. They had no choice except to wait, hope, and pray for a solution. The search went on, day after day, without stopping. Due to the extreme weather conditions, which included freezing winds and snow on occasion, the search conditions were considered to be challenging and risky. In the Siberian wilderness, the expanse of the forest seemed intimidating. Out there, it is possible for a person to vanish without ever being located. The hope of discovering Colin alive began to dwindle as the days continued to pass, with one day turning into 2, then 3, and finally ending up being a full week. In the end, a breakthrough occurred on Monday, April 4th, which was 8 full days after Colin had vanished from the cabin over the previous week. Around 1 mile distant from the cabin, a group of people were searching through a part of forest while looking for the missing person. It was a heavily populated and challenging location to get through. A little clearing appeared in front of them as they made their way through the dense underbrush and the trees that were blocking their path. And in the midst of that expansive clearing, they caught sight of something. It was, as the search party got closer, that they realized their worst fears were correct. Yes, it was Colin. And it was too late for him. In the middle of the clearing, he was discovered lying on his back in a flat position. An odd, almost posed stance was arranged on his body, and it was quite peculiar. His right arm was also extended, but it was bent slightly and brought closer to his body. His left arm was stretched out straight to his side, and his right arm was also extended. At the same time, he had both of his palms gripped into a firm, tight fist. After conducting a more thorough investigation, the first responders discovered a number of unsettling details. On both of his wrists and on both of his hands, there were wounds and abrasions that were clearly evident. The pattern of these injuries appeared to be what a medical examiner would refer to as restraint marks. It appeared as though someone or something had been holding him down with a great deal of force. On the front of his neck, there were also scrapes and abrasions that were present. His attire, which included a thermal shirt with long sleeves, heavy-duty hiking pants, and his robust hiking boots, was ripped and torn in multiple places, which indicated that he had been involved in a violent conflict. In addition to that, there was a peculiar and insignificant information that would turn out to be of great importance. No socks were on Colin's feet at the time. Inside his hiking boots, which were tightly knotted, he was wearing his bare feet. Despite the fact that this may appear to be a trivial matter, for everyone who knew Colin, it was a significant warning sign. A substantial amount of scar tissue was left behind on Colin's ankles as a result of the procedures that he had previously undergone on both of them. It was something that he had mentioned to his friends and family on numerous occasions that if he did not wear thick socks, the scar tissue would scrape against the inside of his boots, causing him to experience excruciating discomfort. Never in his life did he go trekking without his socks on. He adhered to this norm in his daily life. Nevertheless, the state of the body was the aspect that the medical staff who initially inspected it found to be the most puzzling. It is reasonable to anticipate that a body would exhibit substantial signs of decomposition after being exposed to the environment and the animals for a period of 8 days in the remote regions of Siberia. Colin's body, on the other hand, exhibited hardly none. According to the remarks of one official, all of his wounds, including the cuts and abrasions on his wrists and neck, appeared to be fresh. It appeared as if the struggle and his death had occurred no more than a few moments ago. To put it succinctly, the scene did not give the impression that the person had become disoriented and had given in to the elements. It seemed as though the individual had lately been involved in a serious physical altercation, one that he had been unsuccessful in winning. The scene appeared to be that of a homicide. The Russian authorities proceeded with a stunning speed to shut the case, despite the fact that there was a lot of evidence that was both bizarre and persuasive. Their first hypothesis, which swiftly evolved into their official conclusion, was that all 3 of Colin's buddies had to have been involved in the crime. However, the friends were brought in for further interrogation, and they all denied having any involvement with Colin's death. Additionally, they all volunteered to take lie detector tests, which they all passed after they were given the opportunity to do so. It appeared as though the Russian authorities had lost interest in any other possible instances of foul play now that their major suspects had been implicated. Rapidly, they came to an agreement on a conclusive and formal answer. As a result, they came to the conclusion that Colin must have been under the influence of drugs, alcohol, or both. During this changed state, they asserted that he must have wandered out of the cabin in a state of disorientation, become disoriented in the woods, and ultimately succumbed to hypothermia. It was determined that the case was closed. He died of a frozen state. The story has come to an end. The answer that was provided to Colin's parents was not only unsatisfactory, but it was also an insult to their son's memory. They were familiar with Colin. He was not a person who acted recklessly. It was not true that he was a drug user. Furthermore, he was an absolute master when it came to getting around in that particular region of Siberia. The concept that he would simply wander off and become so hopelessly lost that he would die of exposure a mile away from his cabin appeared to be totally absurd. The official account did not make sense, and there were an excessive number of questions that remained unresolved. All of the evidence, including the clenched fists, the restraining marks, the missing socks, the wounds that appeared to be new, and the absence of decomposition, did not fit into the straightforward story of a guy who died from freezing to death. Because they were unwilling to accept the official decision, Colin's parents made the decision to take matters into their own hands. They had the knowledge that they required an impartial and objective opinion. Therefore, they decided to use a private forensic laboratory that is situated in the United States and has a stellar reputation. They arranged for all of the material from the Russian autopsy, including the reports, the photographs, and the findings of the toxicological test, to be delivered to this laboratory for a comprehensive examination. Whether the conclusion reached by the Russians was correct, or whether something far more ominous had occurred to their son, they were interested in being informed. The American laboratory started its investigation, and it didn't take them long to discover significant flaws in the official position taken by the Russian government. As a matter of fact, their discoveries entirely disassembled it, each component by component. The toxicological report was the first thing that they looked at. The Russian authorities had proposed the idea that Colin was either under the influence of alcohol or drugs. After doing an analysis of the toxicology data, the laboratory in the United States came to the conclusion that this is unquestionably not true. Colin was not under the effect of alcohol at any point in it. When he was sober, an extremely minute and insignificant quantity of THC, which is the psychoactive component of marijuana, was discovered in his urine. On the other hand, the level was so low that it suggested that he had probably consumed it quite a few days, if not a week, or perhaps more, before to his disappearance. It is quite unlikely that it would have had any kind of psychotropic impact on him on the night that he goes missing. This discovery was in direct and total opposition to the fundamental tenet of the hypothesis that the Russian police had been using. Second, the laboratory investigated the root of the death. The official diagnosis was hypothermia as the cause of death. But the forensic pathologists from the United States arrived at a different conclusion. According to the evidence that was found in the photographs taken during the autopsy, particularly the abrasions that were found on his neck, as well as other internal markers, they came to the conclusion that Colin did not die as a result of being exposed to the cold. All of the signals, on the other hand, pointed to a considerably more violent conclusion. Based on their findings, they concluded that suffocation was the most likely cause of death. He was the victim of a homicide. Until the moment he passed away, his capacity to breathe was severely restricted because someone had either suffocated him or crushed his airway. This brings us to the third and possibly most disturbing point. The laboratory examined the condition of Colin's body when it was discovered. It was corroborated by them that the initial responders had noticed the nearly complete absence of decomposition, the freshness of the injuries, and the fact that his body had not been touched by any animals that were foraging for food, which is quite unusual for a body that has been left in the woods for more than a week. In light of this information, they came to a conclusion that was shocking. It indicated that Colin had not passed away on the night that he could not be found. It indicated that he had been alive for the majority of the 8 days that hundreds of people had been searching for him, if not all of them simultaneously. The evidence strongly suggested that he had died within a very short time, most likely just a few hours before his body was discovered in that area on April 4th. This was the conclusion that was reached by using the evidence. These fresh discoveries from the American laboratory revealed a horrifying and devastating new picture of what must have occurred to Colin Madsen because of his circumstances. The situation was not one in which a hiker became disoriented. This was a case of kidnapping and murdering the victim. Consequently, let us make an effort to reconstruct the events by using this new evidence that is more exact. On March 28, between the hours of 2 and 5 in the morning, Colin awoke. This occurred somewhere in the pre-dawn hours of the day. He climbed out of his bed in a stealthy manner and exited the cabin. Utilizing the outhouse, which was located a short distance away, would be the most reasonable explanation for this behavior. His attire was not appropriate for a hike. Neither of his belongings were taken by him. Even his socks were not put on by him. The intention was for this to be a little excursion, nothing more than a minute or two, and then straight back to bed. As soon as he went out into the chilly and gloomy morning of Siberia, however, he discovered that he was not alone. They were waiting in the shadows, and it was either someone or some individuals. The fact that a violent struggle took place is something that we are aware of, but we do not know whether they ambushed him or whether they enticed him away from the cabin. These are the telltale indicators of a guy who is battling for his life. The shredded clothing, the abrasions on his hands and wrists, and the clenched fists. On the other hand, he was ultimately defeated. He had been kidnapped. Probably the most terrifying aspect of this enigma is what transpired after that with him. He was kidnapped from the environment surrounding the cabin and held captive for close to 8 days in a location unknown. This is where he was abducted. Why was he taken away from us? We are unable to provide responses to these queries. He was being detained against his will for a period of 8 days, during which time his friends, his family, and a large search party were making frantic efforts to locate him. Imagine the suffering that he must have been subjected to during that period of time. After that, his assailant or assailants murdered him on or around April 4th, which was the day that his body was discovered. Suffocation was the result. Following his passing, his body was relocated and positioned in that area in the forest, which was approximately 1 mile away from the cabin. Where is that? Would you say that the location was one that was chosen on purpose? Was the intention to make it simple to locate in order to convey some kind of message? Or was it simply a spot that was convenient for him to be left? When he is placed on his back with his arms extended, it gives the impression that he was placed there on purpose, rather than being a body that was simply abandoned. Therefore, the most important question is, who would do this and why would they do it? One theory, which is supported by a significant number of individuals, suggests that the Russian government or some local authorities are responsible. In Siberia, it was discovered that Colin, who had a strong commitment to protecting the environment, had taken part in at least one protest that was staged inside a peaceful setting. An unauthorized development in the area of Lake Baikal was the target of the protest. Following the conclusion of this demonstration, it is believed that Colin was issued a formal written warning by the Russian police, instructing him to refrain from attending any such rallies of this nature. What if this is the reason for it? Is it true that he was considered a problematic American activist? What happened to him? Was he singled out, kidnapped for questioning, and then murdered? This is a somewhat unsettling idea. It is possible that this is the reason why the official investigation was so quick to close off any line of inquiry that did not entail a straightforward accident. It's possible that a failed probe was actually a deliberate attempt to cover up the truth. On the other hand, this idea is not without its flaws. With so many other people participating in the demonstration, why would the government single out Colin? And why would they pick to kidnap him on a night when he was with 3 of his closest friends, individuals who would immediately notice his absence and raise the alarm if they were to find him missing? An operation that is being carried out in secret appears to be carried out in a very poor manner. There are other hypotheses that suggest it could have been a crime of opportunity, a robbery that went awry, or a personal quarrel with a nearby resident that we are unaware of. However, none of these hypotheses adequately explain the peculiar and protracted character of the crime, which consisted of the 8-day period of captivity prior to the murder. It was not surprising to see how the Russian authorities would respond to the discoveries that were discovered by the American laboratory. They were entirely disregarded by anyone. They remained steadfast in their judgment that the death was the result of hypothermia brought on by an accident. However, the investigation in Russia has not yet been concluded. This is not a riddle that needs to be solved for them. Those who were close to Colin described the event as a complete nightmare. Not only did they suffer the loss of their good buddy in the most heinous manner, but they also had to go through the agony of being the major suspects in his killing, even if it was only for a little period of time or for a short period of time. The shocking events that transpired over that week are likely to remain with them for the rest of their lives. The anguish that Colin's parents are experiencing is never-ending. Despite their best efforts, they have been unable to achieve justice for their son. The government of Russia does not give any cooperation, does not provide any fresh information, and there is no possibility that the case will ever be reopened. They are left with the horrific knowledge that their kid was murdered, but it is possible that they will never know who was responsible for the crime or why it was committed. When it comes to this investigation, they are forced to consider the same questions over and over again. Who was hiding in the shadows outside of that cabin in the early morning hours when it was completely dark? To what location did they take Colin? And during those 8 days when they were unable to find him, before they killed him and left him deep within that huge and merciless Siberian wilderness, what did they do to him? You are very much appreciated for watching. If you watched today's program, please share your thoughts with me in the comments section. You should also keep in mind that we have a whole playlist of episodes of true crime ready for you to watch in one sitting right now. Up until the next time. What's up? Just before midnight on the 20th of August, 2012, a 19-year-old college student named Rosem and her best friend, 19-year-old Elizabeth Nass, walked down Main Street in their quiet hometown of Ellicott City, Maryland. It was their last night together before they each would pack up their things, say goodbye to their families, and head back to college in separate states. They had spent the entire summer together, hanging out, laughing, and making memories. They knew that once they went back to school, they would be separated by hundreds of miles and busy schedules, so they wanted to make this last night count. To cap off what had felt like an absolutely perfect summer, they decided to grab a few beers, even though they were underage, and head over to their favorite hangout spot. This spot was a train trestle that ran over Main Street. Now, to be clear, this train trestle was not some secret daredevil hideout spot. Lots of people in town knew about it. Lots of kids, including Rosem and Elizabeth Nass, had been up there many, many times before. It was a popular local landmark where teenagers would gather to talk and look at the beautiful lights of the town below. And while there was an active train track that ran across it, the concrete ledge on the trestle where everybody would sit when they were up there was several feet away from the tracks, safely out of the way of any passing trains. You could sit up there on the ledge, look down over the town, and a train could literally pass right by you on the tracks and not affect you at all. So overall, the girls felt it was completely safe to climb up and sit there. So Elizabeth Nass and Rosem climbed up onto the train trestle and took their usual seats along the concrete ledge, safely away from the tracks. They cracked open their beers and began talking about their upcoming college semesters. They talked about which classes they were going to take, what they were looking forward to, and really how much they were going to miss each other. They laughed about old memories from high school and made plans for how they would visit each other during the holidays. Then, at some point, Rosem pulled out her phone and took a photo of her and Elizabeth Nass's feet dangling off the trestle. The photo captured their feet hovering over Main Street with the quiet town lights glowing down below. She quickly posted that photo to Twitter. But as soon as she hit the post button, she and Elizabeth Nass heard a loud screeching sound coming from right behind them. When they turned around to see what it was, something huge smashed into them, and then everything went black. That loud screeching sound was the sound of a train passing by right behind them. But remember, the tracks are set far enough back that the train itself could not hit them. And in this case, the train was not the thing that hit these two girls. Instead, it was something truly unfortunate and rare that happened. When that train passed by the girls, it partially derailed. It was not a full-scale derailment with cars going everywhere off the tracks, but instead, several of these cargo cars toppled over onto their sides. Some of those cars that toppled over were open cars, carrying thousands of pounds of heavy coal. As the cars toppled, all of this coal spilled out, smashing into Rosem and Elizabeth Nass and fully burying them. It was like they were under an avalanche of coal. By the time they were pulled out from under the coal, they were already dead. Rosem and Elizabeth Nass were the only two fatalities from this derailment. Their families would later sue the railroad company, alleging negligence, and each family would receive a settlement, though the exact amounts were never disclosed. The news of the tragic accident quickly spread through the tight-knit community of Ellicott City, leaving everyone in a state of shock and disbelief. Rosem and Elizabeth Nass were well known and incredibly loved by their peers, teachers, and neighbors. A makeshift memorial of flowers, candles, and handwritten notes quickly began to grow near the base of the train trestle as people struggled to make sense of how a simple summer night could end in such an unimaginable disaster. The tragedy sparked intense local debates about safety measures around active railroad lines and whether more should be done to restrict access to landmarks like the trestle. But for the families of the two young women, no amount of safety discussions or legal settlements could ever fill the massive void left by their sudden loss. They were forced to face the upcoming autumn not by sending their daughters off to college, but by holding funerals. It was a stark and haunting reminder of how quickly life can change in the most unexpected way. Before we move on to our next story, I want to take a moment to thank BetterHelp for sponsoring today's video. June is Men's Mental Health Awareness Month, and in honor of that, I wanted to share a quick personal story about my own mental health journey. Back in 2017, I got out of the military after serving for several years. When I transitioned back to civilian life, I went through a major identity crisis. So much of who I was, my entire purpose and sense of self, was wrapped up in being a Navy SEAL. But now that I was out on the other side, it felt like I did not know who I was anymore. I did not even know what kind of job to get, or really what to do with my life. It was this intense existential crisis that quickly sent me into a very dark and depressing spiral. But instead of seeking help or telling anybody about what I was going through, I kept it all bottled up inside. I began lashing out at my family and my friends, and I was just being a complete downer everywhere I went. I was pushed away from the people who cared about me the most. It was not until my family and friends, because they loved me so much, stepped in and confronted me. They told me that I really needed to see someone. That was the moment I finally understood the negative impact I was having on other people and just how bad things had gotten for me personally. And so, I decided to go out and speak to a therapist. At first, I admit I was not sold on the idea. I did not think this was going to be a big solution for me. But pretty quickly, having that neutral third party to bounce ideas off of and gain new perspective from really changed my life. It set me on a course to where I am happy today. I still see a therapist to this day, and it is therapy that got me to this place right now. This emotional equilibrium I have reached is because of therapy. So, if you are struggling right now, I would highly suggest thinking about therapy as an option for you. And a great starting point for therapy is BetterHelp. It is incredibly convenient, primarily because it is entirely online. This makes it so easy and accessible. All you have to do is fill out a quick, simple survey online, and then within 2 days, they will pair you up with a licensed professional therapist. And if for any reason you want to change your therapist, you can do that at any time at absolutely no additional cost. You can click the link in the description below or go to betterhelp.com/MrBallen to get 10% off your first month of therapy. Again, that is betterhelp.com/MrBallen to get 10% off your first month of therapy. Now, let us get back to our stories. At 6 p.m. on the 27th of October 2014, a 17-year-old boy named Jesus Menes was playing basketball with a group of friends on an outdoor basketball court at Kinloch Park in Miami, Florida. The friends had broken up into two teams and were in the middle of a very intense pickup game. The game was pretty close, and Jesus Menes' team was doing really well. They were running up and down the court, sweating in the warm Florida evening heat, completely focused on winning. But at some point, when Jesus Menes and his team had possession of the ball, one of his teammates just got frazzled by the defense and took a crazy three-point shot from way behind the line. The ball sailed right past the hoop, completely missing it, a total air ball, and it bounced and then went clean over a chain-link fence on the edge of the park. As soon as this happened, Jesus Menes and all of his friends let out a collective groan because they knew basically anything that went over that fence was pretty much gone forever. But to Jesus Menes' surprise, one of his friends turned to Jesus Menes and was like, "Hey, why don't you just hop the fence and go get the ball?" Now, Jesus Menes really did not want to do that. He had been coming to this park since he was a small toddler with his family, and his mom and dad had always told him to never, ever climb that fence. Never. But now, Jesus Menes' friend had turned it into a dare, saying, "Come on, Jesus, hop the fence and get the ball." The other friends picked up on this and started egging him on, saying, "Yeah, Jesus, go over there and get the ball." Jesus Menes knew this was not a good idea, but surrounded by all of his peers, he didn't want to look weak or scared. He thought to himself, what is the worst that could happen? And said, all right, I will go get it. Jesus Manus left the basketball court and walked over to this fence, which was about 7 feet tall, with sharp barbed wire across the top of it. He turned back around, and his friends were all smiling and cheering him on. So he began climbing the fence. He reached the top, positioned himself carefully over the barbed wire to avoid cutting himself, and tumbled down to the other side. He hit the ground pretty hard, but stood up, realized he was okay, and looked through the fence at his cheering friends. Jesus Manus was feeling very confident and smiled at them like a hero. He turned around, picked up the basketball, and chucked it back over the fence to his friends. He was about to climb back over when he noticed another basketball that someone else had lost over this fence. Except this basketball was on the other side of a second fence. Basically, once you climb the first fence, a couple of feet later, there is a second fence. These were the two fences that Jesus Manus and everyone who came to this park were warned about. Never climb them. But Jesus Manus had already climbed the first one, got his basketball, and thought he could climb the second one too to get a backup ball. He figured it would be an easy way to get another ball for their games. So, without even telling his friends, Jesus Manus walked over to the second fence, which was identical to the first one, carefully climbed to the top, positioned himself over the barbed wire, and dropped down to the other side. But within seconds of Jesus Manus landing inside of that second fenced-in area, something absolutely horrible happened. His friends back on the court saw what was going on and began totally panicking. They were screaming, running around, and did not know what to do. Eventually, one of them called 911. Minutes later, first responders showed up and found the teenagers completely frantic, pointing toward the fenced-in areas. The first responders looked and knew right away there was virtually nothing they could do to save Jesus Manus. The reason these fences were totally off-limits, and the reason Jesus Manus's family had warned him to never climb them, was because inside of that second fenced-in area was an electrical power grid. There were warning signs all over the fences, but Jesus Manus had ignored them. When he landed inside of that second area, he stepped directly on a live electrical wire. The second he did, 500,000 volts of electricity coursed through his body. For reference, the average lightning bolt contains about 300,000 volts of electricity. When Jesus Manus hit that wire, it was the equivalent of 2 lightning bolts striking him at once, over and over again. Jesus Manus died almost immediately from the massive electrical shock. In the days following the incident, Kinloch Park was filled with grief as classmates, family members, and local residents came to pay their respects to Jesus Manus. A beautiful memorial was set up right by the basketball court where he had spent so much of his life. People left basketballs, signed jerseys, and wrote heartfelt messages on the pavement, mourning the loss of a bright, energetic young man who had his whole life ahead of him. The power company that operated the electrical substation immediately launched an investigation into how the tragedy occurred, ultimately reiterating the importance of the warning signs and the physical barriers that had been put in place to protect the public. The tragedy served as a somber and permanent warning to all the kids in the neighborhood about the invisible, deadly dangers that lay just beyond those chain-link fences. For Jesus Manus's family, the park would never be the same, and they were left with a permanent hole in their hearts. On the afternoon of the 22nd of April 2023, a 49-year-old father of 3 named Carlo Keefe crawled through a cave system in Cumbria, England. He was on his hands and knees, slowly shuffling his way forward, and the only light guiding him through the dark tunnel was the small headlamp on his helmet. Now, Carlo Keefe was an adventurer who loved rock climbing and exploring caves, but this particular cave system was one he was not that familiar with. He had only been here a couple of other times and did not have a map with him, so he did not actually know where he was going. But Carlo Keefe was not remotely worried because he knew this was easily the safest cave system he had ever explored. In fact, this place was so safe that families regularly showed up with their kids and let them run around freely with no fear they would get hurt. Carl O'Keefe had no worries, and he could still hear the other people and their kids playing and laughing just behind him in the entrance area. Even though he did not really know where he was or where the tunnel led, he felt completely fine and was just enjoying the adventure. He was completely alone in the narrow passage, feeling the air. Carl O'Keefe continued crawling through this tunnel and eventually reached a T-intersection where he had to choose between going right or left. Since he had no map, he decided to just go right. He began going down this tunnel, which closely resembled the first one. But as he crawled along, he started to feel like the walls around him were shrinking, and it was getting harder to push his body forward. Finally, when it felt so tight and claustrophobic that he realized he should just turn around, he reached a dead end. Since he could not go further, Carl O'Keefe decided he would make a U-turn with his body to go back the way he came. He was on his hands and knees, facing the dead end. The tunnel was incredibly pitch black and quiet, with only the distant sound of children echoing from far away. Carl O'Keefe tried to shimmy at himself one way or the other, but it was like no matter what he did, he just could not move out of this U-shape. His heart rate began to rise, and it became much harder to breathe. It felt like the walls of this cave were pressing down on him, and he became overwhelmingly claustrophobic. He began to panic and started screaming out for help. Immediately, some of the staff who heard him yelling made their way into the tunnel system and saw Carl O'Keefe wedged there. When they tried to pull him out by his feet, they could not get him to move at all. Sensing a true emergency, the staff backed out and called the fire department. The firefighters came out, but they too could not get Carl O'Keefe out of the tight space. He was completely stuck. All Carl O'Keefe could do was try to stay calm and take measured breaths to avoid restricting his breathing even more. He kept thinking the rescue team would get him out quickly, but to his shock and the shock of the first responders, it would take an agonizing 4 hours to finally free him. During those 4 hours, Carl O'Keefe grew weaker and more panicked as his muscles were crushed. The instant he was freed, he was rushed to the hospital and admitted to the intensive care unit. At the hospital, the doctors discovered that Carl O'Keefe had suffered extensive, severe crush injuries from being trapped in that position for so long. He had severe bone damage, organ damage, and nerve damage throughout his body. Despite heroic efforts by the medical staff to save him, Carl O'Keefe died 8 days later from his injuries. His death became massive national news because it seemed completely impossible that someone could die in a cave system designed to be so safe. But the reason it was so safe was because this was not a real, natural, underground cave system. It was an indoor play center for children. The entire cave system was constructed out of molded plastic tunnels meant for kids to crawl around in during birthday parties. Adults were told they could also go through the tunnels with their kids. Carl O'Keefe had gone to a birthday party for one of his children's friends and brought his kids along. Being the devoted father that he was, he had gone right into the tunnels to play with them, never imagining that a harmless children's toy would end up claiming his life. In the wake of his passing, the play center closed the cave attraction permanently, and local authorities launched a comprehensive review of safety standards for indoor adventure parks, hoping to ensure that no other family would ever have to endure such a shocking and preventable tragedy. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. Sometimes, the choices we make and the secrets we keep can completely alter the course of human lives. In some cases, these choices are driven by a deep, aching desire to heal a broken past and find a way to make things right. In other cases, they are driven by greed, power, and a shocking level of corruption that completely blinds a person to the value of human life. And in the most tragic cases, they are driven by a quiet, toxic malice that operates completely outside the boundaries of the law, leaving behind a devastation that can never truly be repaired. Today, we are going to look at 3 incredible stories that show just how unpredictable and sometimes how utterly terrifying the human experience can be. We begin in the summer of 2007. A 60-year-old man named Michael Dick was living a very quiet, comfortable life in Bow, which is located in East London. Michael was a semi-retired carpenter, and if you were to look at his day-to-day routine, it was pretty normal. He spent most of his time helping out around the house, visiting with his close friends, and being with his family. He was well liked in his neighborhood, which was a peaceful, safe place to live. But even though his life seemed complete on the surface, Michael was harboring a deep, quiet sadness that had been growing inside of him for a very long time. 10 years earlier, back in 1997, Michael had gone through a very messy, painful divorce with his first wife. At the time of the split, they had a daughter together named Lisa, who was 21 years old. When the divorce was finalized, Michael decided he needed a fresh start to escape the bitterness of the separation. He packed up his things and moved about an hour and a half south down to Bow in East London. But his ex-wife and his daughter, Lisa, stayed behind in the family home, which was located in a quiet, historic town called Sudbury in the county of Suffolk, England. Because the divorce had been so hostile and bitter, the communication between Michael and his old family completely broke down. There were no phone calls, no letters, and no updates. As the weeks turned into months, and the months turned into years, Michael completely lost touch with his daughter Lisa. He did not know what she was doing with her life, whether she went to university, if she got married, or if she was even happy. It was like she had vanished from his world entirely. Fast forward 10 years to 2007. Michael is sitting in his home, and suddenly he is hit with this overwhelming, crushing wave of grief. He realized that a whole decade had passed, and he had missed out on his first daughter's entire young adulthood. The guilt of letting those 10 years slip away became absolutely too much for him to bear. He could not stop thinking about her. So he sat down with his current wife and his two younger daughters, and he told them that he had to go find Lisa. He needed to apologize for the lost time, and he wanted to rebuild a relationship with her if she would let him. His family was incredibly supportive. They told him he absolutely had to do it, and that they would help him in any way they could. But the problem was, Michael had absolutely no idea where Lisa was. He did not have her phone number, he did not have an email address, and he had no way of contacting his ex-wife to ask for help because they had cut all ties. The only piece of information he had was the physical address of the brick house they had lived in 10 years ago in Sudbury. And so, in August of 2007, Michael decided that this old house was going to be his starting point. He got into the car with his two younger daughters, and they made the 90-minute drive north to Sudbury. When they arrived, Michael navigated through the familiar streets until he found his old neighborhood. It was a beautiful, quiet street lined with classic brick houses on both sides. He slowly drove down the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, until he spotted his old family home. He pulled the car over, parked right out front, and just sat there for a moment, staring at the front door. His heart was pounding with a mix of hope and sheer anxiety. He stepped out of the car alone, walked up the stone path, took a deep breath, and knocked on the door. After a few moments, the door opened. But the person standing there was not his ex-wife, and it was not Lisa. It was a completely different family who had moved in years after Michael left. Michael politely explained who he was and who he was looking for, but the new owners told him that they had bought the house from someone else and had no idea where the previous occupants had moved. They wished him the best of luck, but they had absolutely no information to give him. Michael thanked them, walked slowly back to his car, and sat in the driver's seat, feeling completely crushed. He looked at his daughters and told them that the trail was completely cold and he did not know what to do next. But his daughters refused to let him give up. They suggested that they just drive around Sudbury for a while. Maybe they would get incredibly lucky and spot Lisa walking down the street, or maybe just seeing the town would spark an idea. So they spent the next couple of hours just aimlessly driving around the streets of Sudbury, looking out the windows and talking about what they should do next. As they drove, they came to the realization that their best bet at finding Lisa was to get some sort of story in the local newspaper. They hoped that if they could get an article published, Lisa, or perhaps someone who knew her, would see it and contact Michael. So, they drove to the headquarters of the local paper, the Suffolk Free Press, and went inside. They managed to speak to a reporter and explained Michael's situation. The reporter thought it was a very touching, interesting human interest story and agreed to write a small feature about Michael's search. The reporter, along with a photographer, brought Michael and his two younger daughters outside onto the street. The photographer had them stand together, and he took a picture of them. The reporter told Michael that in the next edition of the paper, which would run in just a few days, they would publish this picture along with a write-up about his search and his contact information. Michael thanked them profusely, feeling a tiny spark of hope. He and his daughters got back in the car and headed back to Bow, East London to wait. Now, what Michael did not know was that at that exact same time, Lisa was actually beginning to think about finding him too. Lisa was now 31 years old, she was married, she had 3 kids of her own, and she had moved out of Sudbury to a neighboring town. She had been talking to her mother and her friends about how she should go about finding her dad because she wanted her kids to have a relationship with him. But like Michael, she did not have his contact information, she did not have his phone number, and when she searched for him on social media, he was not on there. One day in August, Lisa was at her office. She went into the break room to get a drink, and she saw a copy of the Suffolk Free Press sitting on the coffee table. She picked it up and began casually flipping through the pages. Suddenly, she stopped. She saw a picture of herself. In the background of the main photo, she could clearly see herself and her mother walking along the street. She had been in Sudbury just a couple of days earlier to talk to her mom about how to find her dad, and they had walked down that very street. But then Lisa looked at the main subjects of the photo, the people standing in the foreground. It was a middle-aged man and 2 teenage girls. She stared at the man's face and nearly fell off her chair. It was her father, Michael, and her 2 stepsisters, whom she had never met. She looked at the caption for the photo and read the article. It explained that this man was desperately searching for his daughter, Lisa, whom he had not seen in 10 years. Purely by chance, on the only day Lisa had been in Sudbury talking to her mother about finding her father, she had been walking literally 100 feet behind her father and her stepsisters as they were having their picture taken for the newspaper ad. The photographer had captured all of them in the same frame without even realizing it. Lisa immediately read the article, got her father's contact information, and reached out to him. Initially, when Michael answered the phone and Lisa told him who she was and how she found him, he actually thought it was a scam. He did not believe it was actually her. But eventually she convinced him and he drove right back to Sudbury. They had an incredibly emotional reunion, and Michael got to meet his grandchildren for the very first time. Today, they are still a close part of each other's lives, all because of an unbelievable 1-in-a-million coincidence captured in a single newspaper photograph. That is a story of a long search ending in a beautiful, almost miraculous way. But our next story takes us to a very different part of the world where a man's search for fame and power led to something incredibly dark and deeply disturbing. If you were to picture the Amazon rainforest in your head, you would probably imagine a dense, green, tropical wilderness filled with exotic animals and winding rivers. And you would be right. That is a very accurate representation of the Amazon. But what a lot of people do not know is that the Amazon rainforest is also home to a massive, bustling city. It is called Manaus, and it sits right in the middle of the rainforest, right along the banks of the Amazon River. Manaus is a city of extremes, and unfortunately, it happens to be one of the most violent places in the entire world. In Manaus, the drug trade and gang violence are extremely prevalent. All it takes is walking down the wrong street or crossing the wrong person, and you can get shot or stabbed in broad daylight with virtually nothing anyone can do to stop it. The police are often overwhelmed, underfunded, and sometimes even complicit in the chaos. In 1989, a 31-year-old former police officer named Wallace Souza decided that he wanted to do something about the state of his hometown. He wanted to make a television show that would show people what it was actually like to live in Manaus. Now, there were other crime shows in Brazil at the time, but they often censored the most graphic content. They would blur out the bodies or avoid showing the true horror of the crime scenes. Wallace decided he was not going to do that. He felt that the only way to expose the harsh reality of life in Manaus was to show everything without any filter. So, that year, he launched a show called Canal Livre, which translates to Free Channel. True to his word, there was absolutely no filter on what went on the air. The show was shocking, raw, and incredibly graphic. Viewers were given a front row seat to freshly murdered victims, lying in the road, slumped over chairs in restaurants, or dead behind the steering wheels of their cars. The cameramen would zoom in on the fatal injuries, the blood spatter, and the faces of the deceased. They would show the grieving family members crying out in pain, completely raw and unedited. But in between these very dark, violent segments about gang killings and drug deals gone wrong, Canal Livre also had a much lighter, almost bizarre side. They would bring on local artists to talk about their work, or they would focus on down-on-their-luck families that needed help, using the show to raise money for them. And then, for seemingly no reason at all, there was a recurring segment where a puppet character would get into physical fights with a man selling bread. It was a totally strange, chaotic spectacle, and the people of Manaus absolutely loved it. Eventually, the show became incredibly popular, not just in Manaus, but across all of Brazil. Because Wallace was often on camera hosting the show, he became extremely famous and highly recognizable. When he walked down the streets of Manaus, people would see him and literally start clapping and cheering for him. He was seen as a hero who was brave enough to show the truth that the government wanted to hide. As his popularity grew, Wallace decided that he did not just want to report on crime, he wanted to fight it from a position of authority. On the air, he would constantly berate the government for failing to protect its citizens, and he would mock the police for their inability to catch criminals. Off the air, he decided to run for political office. He campaigned hard on a platform of law and order, promising to clean up the streets of Manaus. He was elected with a massive majority, and he quickly became one of the most beloved, influential, and trusted public figures in all of Brazil. However, over the years, there was one very strange thing about Canal Livre that some people began to notice. It was a detail that was hard to ignore, and it was most obvious in a now famous episode that aired in the mid-2000s. This particular episode opens with a Canal Livre reporter making their way through a dense patch of jungle. A cameraman is filming them from behind as they push branches out of the way and carefully step over the thick underbrush. Up ahead, there is a small clearing, and standing in this clearing is a third person who is looking down at something on the ground. The reporter finally makes his way into the clearing, and the cameraman follows, pointing the camera down at the ground. What you see on the ground looks like a black, charred log that is still smoking. But as the cameraman zooms in, you realize it is not a log at all. It is a human being. The body is badly burned and still actively smoking, meaning this person had been set on fire just minutes before the camera crew arrived. It was a horrifying sight. But then, the reporter starts talking about the victim with an incredible amount of detail. He tells the audience that the victim is a man, that he had not been shot, and that he had been doused with gasoline and burned alive. The problem was, the police had not even arrived at the scene yet. No medical examiner had looked at the body, and because the body was so badly charred, it was virtually impossible to tell just by looking at it whether the victim was male, whether there were gunshot wounds, or what accelerant had been used. When people began to question how Canal Livre always managed to arrive at these crime scenes so quickly and how they had so much detailed information before the police, Wallace had a quick answer. He told them that they were simply a very popular show with a huge network of informants, that people called them before they called the police, and that they constantly monitored police radios and the city morgue. For a long time, people accepted this explanation. But everything changed in October of 2008. That month, the police arrested a former Manaus police officer who went by the name Moa. He was accused of committing 9 murders and was thrown into jail. Despite the incredibly serious charges against him, Moa seemed completely unfazed. He acted like a man who knew he had powerful connections on the outside, someone who would step in at any moment and get him out of prison. But as the weeks went on, nobody came to save Moa. He just continued to sit in his cell, and eventually the reality of his situation began to sink in. He realized he had been abandoned. So he decided to start talking, and the story he told would shock the entire nation of Brazil. Moa admitted to the police that he had killed several people. But then he said that he was just a hitman. He claimed that the person who was hiring him to commit these murders was none other than Wallace Souza. The police began a massive, secret investigation. What they discovered was absolutely mind-blowing. It turned out that Wallace Souza had started Canal Livre with good intentions, but as the show became massively popular, it gave him an immense amount of power and influence. And that power corrupted him completely. Wallace had secretly formed his own powerful drug cartel. In order to protect his drug territory, eliminate his rivals, and boost his television show's ratings, Wallace had started hiring hitmen like Moa to assassinate rival gang members. Wallace would tell the hitmen exactly who to kill, where to do it, and at what exact time. Once the hit was planned, Wallace would coordinate with his news producers. He would send his camera crews to the exact location of the planned murder, timing it so they would arrive either right as the crime was happening or immediately after. This allowed Canal Livre to get the absolute most graphic, exclusive footage before any other news outlet and long before the police could even secure the scene. They were literally creating the news they were reporting on. It took the police a full year to compile enough evidence, but in October of 2009, they finally charged Wallace Souza with murder, conspiracy, and drug trafficking. Wallace initially went on the run, but he eventually turned himself in, maintaining his innocence and claiming that he was the victim of a political conspiracy. However, Wallace would never stand trial. Before his case could go before a judge, he suffered a massive heart attack and died in prison in 2010. Because of his death, the full extent of his crimes was never fully revealed, and we will never know exactly how many people he had killed for the sake of his television ratings. But investigators were able to prove that at least 3 of the victims shown on Canal Livre had been killed directly on Wallace's orders, including the man who had been burned alive in the jungle. But the story does not end there. The person who paid the ultimate price for exposing this massive conspiracy was Moa, the hitman who had blown the whistle on Wallace. On New Year's Day in 2017, a massive violent prison riot broke out at the facility where Moa was being held. A powerful crime syndicate overran the guards and took control of the prison, and they had a specific list of targets they wanted to eliminate. One of those targets was Moa, whom they viewed as a traitor for cooperating with the police. An angry mob of armed inmates made their way to Moa's cell. When they found him, Moa was pressed flat against the back wall of his cell, as far away from the bars as he could possibly get, pleading for his life. The mob, armed with machetes and knives, began hacking at the cell door, trying to break the lock to get inside and cut him to pieces. But the lock was too strong, and they could not get the door open. Realizing they could not reach him with their blades, they decided to do something else. They reached through the bars with a lighter and set Moa's mattress on fire. The flames quickly spread, filling the tiny cell with thick, toxic smoke and intense heat. With nowhere to run and no way to escape, Moa was trapped. He was burned alive inside his cell, suffering the exact same horrific fate that he and Wallace had inflicted on their victims years before. This is a terrifying example of how greed and a desire for control can lead to absolute horror. But sometimes, control does not come from a drug cartel or a television show. Sometimes it comes from someone you trust completely, someone you consider to be your very best friend. And that brings us to our third and final story, which took place in Sydney, Australia. In 2010, an 18-year-old girl named Renee Marsden was living in Sydney with her parents and her 3 siblings. Renee was a very bright, outgoing, and popular young woman who had a large circle of friends. She was also incredibly close with her family, especially with her mother, Teresa. Teresa had given birth to Renee when she was only 19 years old. Because of their relatively close age gap as Renee grew into a young woman, their relationship evolved from a traditional mother-daughter dynamic into a deep, trusting friendship. Renee saw her mother as her ultimate confidant. She would come home and tell Teresa absolutely everything that was going on in her life, from her daily routines to her deepest secrets. In 2010, Renee was going through a very difficult time. She had been dating a young man for nearly 2 years, and she was madly in love with him. But one day, she discovered a series of text messages that made it clear he was cheating on her and did not really care about her. Renee was completely heartbroken. She confronted her boyfriend with the messages, but he completely denied sending them. He swore up and down that he had never cheated on her, that he loved her, and that he had no idea where those messages had come from. But Renee, feeling betrayed and confused, did not believe him. She felt she had no choice but to break up with him. During this painful period, Renee spent hours talking to her mother, crying and trying to process the end of her relationship. Teresa did her best to comfort her daughter, telling her that time heals all wounds and that she would eventually find the right person who would treat her with the respect she deserved. For a couple of weeks, Renee was deeply depressed. She barely wanted to leave her room. But then, quite suddenly, she came home from work one day and walked through the front door with a massive smile on her face. She was practically radiating happiness, which was a huge contrast to how she had been acting. Teresa immediately noticed the change and asked her what had happened to put her in such a great mood. Renee smiled and told her mother that she had met a new guy. Teresa was thrilled to see her daughter happy again, and she eagerly asked who this new person was. Renee explained that his name was Braden Spiteri. He was 23 years old, and he came from a very wealthy, prominent family. He had graduated from the King's School, which is an extremely prestigious boys' school in Sydney, and his father owned a highly successful construction company that Braden was set to inherit. Renee described him as handsome, kind, and absolutely perfect. Teresa asked how they had met, and Renee explained that her best friend, Camilla Zidon, had introduced them. Camilla and Renee had been best friends since high school, and Camilla was always over at the Marsden house, so Teresa knew her very well. Renee told her mother that Braden was actually Camilla's ex-boyfriend, but they had dated a long time ago, and there were absolutely no lingering feelings between them. They were just good friends now. According to Renee, Camilla had seen how depressed Renee was after her breakup, and she wanted to help her find happiness again. So, Camilla had set her up with Braden. When Teresa heard this, a small red flag went up in her mind. She knew that dating a best friend's ex-boyfriend could easily lead to drama and hurt feelings, even if everyone claimed to be fine with it. She looked at Renee and asked if she really thought it was a good idea to get involved with Camilla's ex. But Renee quickly brushed her concerns aside, saying that Camilla was completely supportive and just wanted her to be happy. Still feeling a bit uneasy, Teresa asked to see a picture of this new guy. Renee pulled out her phone and showed her a photo of Braden. He was indeed a very handsome young man with a bright, welcoming smile. But as Teresa looked closer at the photo, she noticed something that made her uncomfortable. In the picture, Camilla was leaning her head heavily on Braden's shoulder, looking very much like his girlfriend. Teresa kept her thoughts to herself, but she could not shake the feeling that this situation was complicated and potentially dangerous. Over the next few weeks and months, Renee's relationship with Braden seemed to blossom rapidly. They were texting each other constantly, day and night. Renee had her phone out almost 24 hours a day, smiling at her screen as she exchanged messages with Braden. But as the months went by, Teresa noticed something odd. Renee and Braden had still not met up in person since they began officially dating. Every single time they made plans to meet, something would come up at the last minute. Either Braden would have an emergency at work, or Renee would have a family conflict. It was always some seemingly legitimate excuse, but it happened every single time. Eventually, the couple stopped trying to arrange face-to-face meetings altogether. It was as if they had built this incredibly intense, emotional relationship entirely through their phone screens, and actually meeting in person had become too intimidating or awkward. They were completely content just living in this digital world together. This unusual text-only relationship continued for nearly a year until January of 2012, when a massive tragedy struck. Braden was involved in a horrific motorcycle accident. He survived the crash, but his passenger, who was also his best friend, a young man named Richie, did not survive. He was killed instantly. The police investigated the accident and determined that Braden had been driving recklessly, and he was subsequently charged with manslaughter. He was convicted and sentenced to 2 years in prison. When Teresa heard about the accident, she felt a complex mix of emotions. On one hand, she felt terrible for the young man who had lost his life and for Braden's family. But on the other hand, a protective, motherly part of her felt a sense of relief. She assumed that with Braden going to prison for 2 years, the relationship would naturally come to an end. She hoped that Renee would finally move on and find someone she could actually spend time with in the real world. But that is not what happened. Braden was sent to Goulburn Prison, a high-security facility located about 2 hours south of Sydney. Shortly after he arrived, Renee informed her family that Braden's family had somehow managed to smuggle a mobile phone into the prison for him. And just like that, their constant texting resumed, as if nothing had changed. Renee's family was deeply unhappy about this. They tried to talk to her, telling her that she was wasting her youth on a man in prison and that this relationship was heading down a very dark and difficult path. But Renee refused to listen. She was completely devoted to Braden. In fact, over the next several months, their relationship only grew more intense. They made plans to get married as soon as Braden was released, which was scheduled for late 2013. Renee was overjoyed and began throwing herself into wedding preparations. She spent hours online buying a beautiful wedding tiara on eBay, booking a professional photographer, and even contacting the Greek consulate to see if Braden, as a convicted felon, would be allowed to enter Greece for their planned honeymoon. But then, in August of 2013, just 2 months before Braden's scheduled release date, everything began to unravel in a very strange way. One afternoon, Teresa received a text message on her phone. It was from Braden, which was highly unusual because he rarely communicated with Teresa directly. The message was frantic. It told Teresa that she needed to check on Renee immediately because she was talking about ending her life. Terrified, Teresa ran straight to Renee's bedroom. She found Renee sitting quietly on her bed. Teresa sat down beside her, put a comforting hand on her shoulder, and asked if she was okay and what was going on. Renee looked up, seemingly confused, and said that she was fine, and asked why her mother was asking. Teresa showed her the text message from Braden. As soon as Renee saw the screen, her face fell. She let out a heavy sigh, looked at her mother, and said that they had just broken up and that their relationship was completely over. She insisted that she was not going to hurt herself, but that she was just incredibly sad. Teresa felt a sudden wave of relief mixed with deep sympathy for her daughter. She knew how painful breakups were, but she also believed that this was the best possible outcome for Renee's future. She stayed with Renee for a while, talking and comforting her until Renee seemed to calm down. Renee then told her mother that she wanted to go out that night with her friends to try and clear her head and forget about the breakup. Teresa thought this was a healthy idea. She sat on the bed and watched as Renee stood in front of the mirror, putting on her makeup and getting dressed up. When she was ready, Renee gave her mother a tight hug, kissed her on the cheek, and said she would see her later. Then she walked out the door. A few hours later, Teresa's phone buzzed. It was a text message from Renee. But as Teresa read the message, her heart sank. The text began with Renee saying how much she loved her mother and how sorry she was for the pain she was about to cause her. She wrote that if Teresa ever wanted to talk to her, she just had to call out her name and she would be there. Teresa was instantly gripped by panic. She did not fully understand what the message meant, but she knew it sounded like a goodbye. She immediately dialed Renee's number, but it went straight to voicemail. She called again and again, but there was no answer. She sent a desperate text message begging Renee to call her back, but she received no response. In a state of pure terror, Teresa called Camilla, Renee's best friend. She asked Camilla if she had heard from Renee or knew where she was. Camilla sounded shocked and told Teresa that she had actually just received a very similar frightening text message from Renee that simply said she loved her and was sorry. The two women decided they had to find her immediately. They met up and spent the next several hours driving frantically all over Sydney, checking every place they thought Renee might go. But there was no sign of her anywhere. Eventually, feeling completely helpless, they drove back to Teresa's house. By this time, Teresa's husband and Renee's siblings were all awake, gathered in the living room, waiting in agonizing silence for any news. At around 9:30 that night, there was a loud knock on the front door. Teresa ran to open it, hoping it was Renee. But instead, she was met by two police officers. The officers explained that they had found Renee's car parked in an unauthorized area, but she was not inside or anywhere near the vehicle. They had come to the family home to see if they knew where she was. When the family explained these suicidal text messages, the officers' faces grew grave. Without hesitating, Teresa and her husband ran to their car and drove straight to the location where the police had found Renee's vehicle. The car was parked in a beautiful but notorious area of Sydney known as the Gap. The Gap is a famous peninsula characterized by steep sandstone cliffs that drop directly into the churning ocean below. It is a place of incredible natural beauty, but it is also tragically well known as a site where many people go to end their lives. When the parents arrived, they rushed to Renee's car and searched it, but it was empty. They began running up and down the paved walking paths that lined the edge of the cliffs, calling out Renee's name into the dark, windy night. But there was no answer, only the sound of the waves crashing against the rocks far below. As Teresa searched, she climbed up to one of the highest lookout points on the cliff. There, on the ground, right in front of the safety fence designed to keep people away from the edge, she found something that shattered her heart. Placed neatly side by side on the gravel were Renee's flat black shoes. The police conducted an extensive search of the cliffs and the water below that night, but because of the darkness and the rough sea conditions, they could find no sign of Renee. The following day, investigators located a security camera that was positioned to monitor that specific section of the Gap. They pulled the footage from the previous night and began to watch. On the video, they saw Renee. She was walking slowly up the trail, alone in the dark. She stopped near the lookout point, bent down, took off her shoes, and placed them neatly together on the ground. Then she climbed over the safety fence. The fence was set back a few feet from the actual drop-off. The footage showed Renee taking a few steps toward the sheer edge and peeking over into the abyss. She looked visibly terrified. She took a few steps backward, pressing her back flat against the safety fence. She pulled out her phone and stood there for a few moments, typing. This was the moment she sent the 3 final text messages. One was to her mother, one was to Camilla, and one was to Braden. Once the messages were sent, Renee took her phone and threw it far out over the edge, watching as it disappeared into the ocean. Then she sat down on the ground and began to shimmy herself slowly forward toward the edge of the cliff until she went out of the camera's frame. It was clear to the investigators that Renee had jumped to her death. Despite search efforts, her body was never recovered from the ocean. The family was absolutely destroyed. They could not understand how a young woman who had been planning her wedding, buying a tiara, and looking forward to her future just days before could suddenly decide to end her life. They were convinced that the key to understanding her death lay with Braden Spiteri. They believed that whatever had happened during their sudden breakup had pushed her over the edge. They tried to contact Braden, but his phone was disconnected. Desperate for answers, they contacted the police and asked them to arrange a meeting with Braden at Goulburn Prison, where he was supposedly serving his sentence. The police agreed and contacted the administration at Goulburn Prison to inquire about an inmate named Braden Spiteri. But when the prison officials checked their records, they told the police something that sent a chill down their spines. They had no record of anyone named Braden Spiteri. Not only was he not currently at the prison, but no one by that name had ever been incarcerated there. The police began a deeper investigation into this mysterious young man. They traced the phone records, the social media accounts, and the IP addresses associated with Braden Spiteri. And what they uncovered was a level of deception that was almost impossible to comprehend. Braden Spiteri did not exist. He was a completely fictitious person. And the person who had created him, the person who had been texting Renee day and night for nearly 2 years, pretending to be the love of her life, was none other than her best friend, Camilla Zaiden. The photograph that Renee had shown her mother, the one where Camilla was resting her head on Braden's shoulder, was not a photo of Camilla's ex-boyfriend. It was just a photo of a completely random guy that Camilla had met once at a nightclub and asked to take a picture with. She had used his face to create this entire elaborate lie. As the police dug deeper into the girl's history, a horrifying pattern of toxic, obsessive control began to emerge. It turned out that Camilla had been deeply, pathologically possessive of Renee ever since they met in high school. She did not want anyone else to have Renee's attention or affection. When Renee had started dating her previous boyfriend of 2 years, Camilla had grown incredibly jealous. In order to destroy that relationship and regain control over Renee, Camilla had secretly fabricated the cheating text messages. She had created fake accounts, sent those messages to herself or to Renee, and then convinced Renee that her boyfriend was a liar and a cheat. Trusting her best friend completely, Renee had broken off the relationship exactly as Camilla had planned. Then, seeing how devastated Renee was, Camilla had swooped in to play the hero. She created the persona of Braden Spiteri, a wealthy, perfect man who would heal Renee's broken heart. Camilla had spent the next 2 years living a double life. She would spend the day hanging out with Renee in person as her best friend, and then spend the night texting Renee as Braden, whispering sweet, romantic things to her through a fake phone number. But the facade began to crack in June of 2013. During an intense text conversation with Braden, Renee had opened up about her frustrations with her real-life friend, Camilla. She told Braden that Camilla had become incredibly toxic, mean, and controlling, and that she was seriously considering ending her friendship with her. On the other end of the phone, Camilla was reading these messages. She was furious. She realized that despite all her efforts to control Renee, Renee was starting to see through her and wanted to push her away. Camilla's obsession turned into a dark desire for revenge. She decided that if she could not control Renee, she would destroy her. and she would use the character of Braden to do it. On the afternoon of the 5th of August, 2013, Renee was out having lunch with a coworker. She was happy, planning her future wedding, when she suddenly received a cold, abrupt text message from Braden out of the blue saying that he needed a break from her and that it was over. Renee was completely blindsided and devastated. She tried calling him repeatedly, but the call would not go through. Desperate and confused, she decided to do something she had never done before. She called Goulburn Prison directly, hoping to speak to a guard or an administrator who could help her get in touch with Braden. The call was placed at 2:45 that afternoon. While we do not know the exact details of the conversation, it is almost certain that the prison staff informed Renee that there was no inmate named Braden Spiteri at their facility. In that single, horrifying moment, the illusion shattered. Renee would have realized that the man she had loved for 2 years, the man she was planning to marry, was a total lie. And as she began to connect the dots, she would have realized that the person behind this cruel, elaborate deception was her very best friend, Camilla. The embarrassment, the shock, and the absolute betrayal were too much for Renee's 18-year-old mind to process. She felt completely violated, foolish, and deeply broken. She could not bring herself to confess this massive, humiliating truth to her mother, who was her confidant. The weight of the realization was so heavy that she felt she could not survive it. And so, later that evening, she walked out of her house and made the tragic journey to the Gap Cliffs. When the truth finally came out, Renee's family demanded justice. They wanted Camilla to be held criminally responsible for what she had done, for driving their daughter to her death. But they were met with a harsh, frustrating reality. In Australia, as in many parts of the world at the time, there were no laws against catfishing. Creating a fake online persona and using it to deceive someone, even if it leads to devastating psychological harm, was not considered a criminal offense. Because Camilla had not physically forced Renee to jump, she could not be charged with any crime related to her death. Throughout the inquest and the media coverage that followed, Camilla refused to take any responsibility for what happened. She never apologized to Renee's family, and she never showed any remorse for the incredible devastation she had caused. Today, Renee's family is left with a profound, lingering grief and a sense of anger that may never truly fade. They are forced to live with the knowledge that the person who destroyed their daughter's life is walking free, completely unpunished by the law. The story of Renee Marsden is a haunting reminder of the dark side of our connected world. It shows us that the people we think we know, the people we let into our lives and our hearts, can sometimes be the very ones who are plotting our destruction. And it leaves us with the unsettling truth that sometimes the most horrific acts of cruelty can be committed without ever breaking a single law on the books. These 3 stories, from the miraculous reunion of Michael and Lisa, to the bloody, corrupt empire of Wallace Sousa, and finally to the tragic digital betrayal of Renee Marsden, show us the incredible spectrum of human behavior. They remind us of the power of our actions, the weight of the choices we make, and the enduring, sometimes devastating consequences that follow them. And the 3rd story is the one that people still debate to this day. Because depending on your perspective, it might not even be considered a crime. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if you're not ready to stop, there's another story waiting for you right now.